There is a particular kind of story that lives outside the main current of things, pulled slightly away from the central river of events, existing in its own quiet space. The Dragon Ball Z films are that kind of story. 13 theatrical releases, spanning a decade of production, each one arriving in Japanese theaters with its own atmosphere and its own intentions, each one offering something that the weekly broadcast could not always afford to give: completion, scope, and a certain cinematic weight that the limited runtime of a television episode could only gesture toward. These films were their own tradition, their own lineages. So let yourself settle in, let your breathing slow, and if this helps you rest tonight, you're welcome to subscribe for more calm Dragon Ball stories. And tell me where you're listening from before the first of these 13 films begins to unspool slowly across the quiet of wherever you find yourself tonight. In a tradition that Toei Animation sustained across a decade of care and craft, the experience of watching a Dragon Ball Z film in a Japanese theater in the early 1990s was something specific and unrepeatable. The theatrical schedule was tied to 2 annual film festivals, the Toei Anime Fair in the spring and a summer event, and the films released there were often paired with other animated features from Toei's roster, creating a single shared event that children and families attended together. The Dragon Ball Z films in this context were not standalone experiences. They were part of something larger, a celebration, a gathering, a seasonal ritual that happened twice a year and that an entire generation of Japanese children grew up attending. This is worth holding in mind when thinking about what these films were for, because understanding their purpose changes the way they read. They were not made to expand the lore. They were made to give the audience exactly what they loved, in concentrated form, on a screen large enough to feel genuinely enormous. The films varied in length, in ambition, in the quality of their antagonists, and in how closely they engaged with the emotional texture of the series that surrounded them. Some of them introduced villains who became beloved entirely on their own terms, figures who never appeared in the manga or the broadcast series, but who accumulated significance through repeated viewing and through the particular weight of a well-constructed story arc compressed into 45 minutes. Others were lighter, almost more like extended episodes, lovingly animated and full of energy but not quite carrying the gravity of the strongest entries. All of them, every single one, are worth knowing. The first Dragon Ball Z film arrived in theaters on July 15, 1989. It was called Dead Zone in the English release, and its Japanese title was Dragon Ball Z Return My Gohan. The second title is more revealing. The film's emotional center was not the villain, impressive as he was. The emotional center was a 4-year-old boy taken from his father and the father's effort to get him back. Before you drift into sleep, you're welcome to subscribe for more calm Dragon Ball stories. And if you feel like it, tell me where you're listening from tonight. That boy was Son Gohan, Goku's first child, who at the beginning of the film was living peacefully in the mountains with his parents and learning to read. He wore a small purple hat with a dragon on it, and he had not yet learned to fight because Goku had decided, for reasons that were quietly complicated, to raise him as a scholar rather than a warrior. He was 4 years old and very gentle, and his power level, as would eventually become impossible to ignore, was already extraordinary. He was not aware of this. He went about his small life in the mountains without any framework for understanding what he carried inside him. The antagonist of the first film was Garlic Jr., a small, round, pale figure with an enormous head and a voice that carried weight well beyond his physical presence. He arrived with a group of followers, Nikki, Ginger, and Sancho, each of them powerful and each of them loyal. And he attacked Goku's home not out of any particular grudge against Goku, but because he wanted the Dragon Balls. And because one of the Dragon Balls was in the possession of Goku's household, Gohan was taken as leverage. Chi-Chi was injured, and Goku, arriving home to find his son gone, began to move. Garlic Jr. was the son of a figure named Garlic, who had long before competed with Kami, the guardian of Earth, for the position of Earth's protector, and who had been sealed away when he lost that competition. The son had inherited his father's rage and his father's ambition, and he had inherited something else as well. The ability, once the Dragon Balls granted his wish, to achieve immortality. He made this wish. The film's climactic battle, then, was against an opponent who could not die, which was a narrative constraint that the film resolved through the mechanism of a dimensional prison, the Dead Zone, the phenomenon that gave the English release its title, a void from which nothing could escape, which Garlic Jr. himself had once used against his enemies, and which was ultimately turned against him. Piccolo arrived at this battle as well, and his presence in the first film established something important about the Dragon Ball Z movies as a tradition. They would not always honor the precise continuity of the broadcast series, and they would sometimes create small contradictions, but they would consistently try to capture the feeling of the relationships they contained. Piccolo and Goku fighting alongside each other without trusting each other toward a shared goal. This was a dynamic the series had been building carefully, and the film understood its texture even if the specific timeline was ambiguous. The climax arrived when Gohan, pushed past the limits of endurance and flooded with adrenaline, in the particular way that small children are when they are in danger and there is no other option, unleashed a burst of power that sent Garlic Jr. into the dead zone he had created. The blast came from somewhere Gohan did not understand and could not reproduce intentionally. He did not know he had done it afterward. He was 4 years old, and then the battle was over, and then he was home, and then he went to sleep. That burst of energy, hidden, untrained, enormous, was a seed the series would spend years developing. But in the first film, it was simply a miracle. A child who did not know his own strength, protecting the people he loved. The second Dragon Ball Z film was called The World's Strongest in English, and in Japanese it was Kono yo de Ichiban Tsuyoyatsu, the strongest guy in the world. It arrived in theaters on March 9, 1990, and it was a film built around a premise that was, at its core, philosophical before it was physical. The antagonist was Dr. Cochin, and behind Dr. Cochin was Dr. Wheelo, a scientist of immense intellect who had, decades before the film's events, been working on a project to preserve human consciousness. The work had been interrupted by circumstance, and Dr. Wheelo had ended up with his brain preserved in a large mechanical apparatus, a machine that kept him alive at the cost of everything he had once been. He existed as pure intelligence inside a mechanical shell, and what he wanted was a body. Specifically, he wanted the most powerful body in the world because he believed that a brain of his caliber deserved the finest possible vessel. He initially believed that the world's strongest person was Master Roshi. This was, in a certain light, flattering. Roshi had been, in his prime, a figure of genuine legend, and the fact that Wheelo's research led him to Roshi first suggested that the old man's reputation had outlasted its practical applications without diminishing its cultural weight. Roshi was kidnapped. The film began with the premise that Roshi needed rescuing, which placed Goku and Bulma and the others in the position of pursuers rather than defenders. Dr. Cochin had a trio of bio-warriors, artificially created fighters named Misokatsun, Ebifuria, and Kishime, who were the film's secondary antagonists and who each presented a distinct kind of challenge. Misokatsun was enormous and possessed an unusual property. His body absorbed kinetic energy, which meant that striking him harder simply resulted in a more powerful rebound. Ebifuria could generate cold and could encase opponents in ice if given the opportunity. Kishime moved through the air on currents of electricity and struck with whip-like tentacles that delivered powerful shocks. They were inventive creations for a film, each designed to demonstrate a different aspect of the kind of creativity that goes into imagining fighting challenges beyond the simple exchange of force. Piccolo was captured and held. Goku fought his way through the facility, and eventually the film arrived at its central confrontation. Goku against Dr. Wheelo himself, now in full control of an enormous mechanical body that dwarfed everything around it. There is something quietly poignant about Dr. Wheelo as a villain. He was not cruel in any fundamental sense. He had not dedicated his life to conquest or to the suffering of others. He had been a scientist who loved knowledge, and a catastrophe had preserved him in a form that could hold knowledge but could not live. His desire for a body was the most human desire imaginable, the desire to simply exist in the world as a person, not as a mechanism. The fact that pursuing this desire required him to kidnap and harm others did not make him sympathetic in a way that excused those actions, but it did make him understandable, which is its own kind of weight, and which was a quality the Dragon Ball Z films would return to with varying degrees of success across the decade that followed. The battle ended with Goku launching a Kamehameha wave of such force that it sent Whilow's mechanical body into the upper atmosphere, where it continued upward until it exited the planet entirely. This was, by the standards of the series, a relatively contained resolution, and it fit the film's register well. The second movie was not trying to end the world. It was asking what strength was for, and what a person without a body was, and whether intelligence without presence was worth the name. The third Dragon Ball Z film carried the title The Tree of Might in English, and in Japan it was called Chikyu Marugoto Choukasen, roughly Super Battle for Earth as a whole. It released on July 7, 1990, and it introduced a concept and a character that would each prove significant in different ways. The concept was the Tree of Might itself, a vast organism from space that when planted on a planet drew every unit of energy from that planet's biosphere to produce a single fruit. The fruit, when consumed, granted the one who ate it an enormous and lasting increase in power. The planet that hosted the tree was destroyed in the process, its energy entirely extracted, its ecosystems dead, and its surface scorched. The tree was not malicious. It was simply a mechanism of extraction, and it did not care what it extracted, or from whom. The character was Turles, a Saiyan warrior who bore an extraordinary physical resemblance to Goku. In the film's original Japanese, this resemblance was acknowledged and left slightly mysterious. In the English dub and in later supplementary materials, it was suggested that this resemblance was because all low-class Saiyan warriors shared similar physical templates, which was itself an interesting world-building detail. The Saiyan caste system was so thorough that even biology was standardized at the lower levels. Individuality being a quality the system reserved for its elites, Turles had planted the Tree of Might on Earth, and his intention was to harvest the fruit and consume it, claiming the power of an entire planet's biosphere for himself and his small crew of followers. He was not invested in the destruction of Earth specifically. Earth was simply the current location of the tree. The planet's eventual death was incidental to his purposes, a side effect, not a goal. What made Turles compelling as a film antagonist was not his power, though his power was considerable, but his relationship to Goku. Turles represented a path, the path Goku would have walked had he remained a Saiyan warrior with Saiyan values, had the bump on the head from the fall as an infant not changed who he was at the foundational level. He looked at Goku and saw waste, a warrior of extraordinary potential who had chosen, as he saw it, to reduce himself to the role of a planet's protector, guarding creatures weaker than himself as though that guarding had value. He offered Goku the fruit. He genuinely offered it, not as a trick, but as an invitation. Come with me. Become what you were supposed to be. Goku declined. The reasons he declined were not articulated at length, because Goku did not articulate such things at length. He declined because the Earth was his home and the people on it were his people, and he was not going to allow them to be drained to fuel someone else's ambition, regardless of what power that someone could offer him. The decision was not a philosophical statement. It was simply who Goku was, and Turles, to his credit, received the refusal without apparent surprise. He had offered. He had been declined. Now they would fight. The battle was difficult. Turles had consumed a portion of the fruit, enough to elevate his power significantly, and Goku, even drawing on the Kaioken technique that had been introduced in the broadcast series, found himself at a disadvantage. He was losing. He was losing clearly, and the people around him were not able to compensate and the tree continued to grow while the fight continued. The resolution came through a spirit bomb, a Genki Dama, the technique given to Goku by King Kai and requiring the donation of energy from willing living things. With the tree present, the living things of Earth had already been weakened, their energy partly drawn. But the spirit bomb gathered what remained. Every small fraction of willingness from every living creature on the planet that the tree had not yet reached, and the ball that resulted was enough. The tree was destroyed, Turles was destroyed, the Earth, given time, would recover. The third film was also Gohan's first real moment of heroism in the theatrical tradition. He had aged slightly from the infant of the first film. He was now closer to 5 years old, and during the battle he encountered the dragon who had been injured by the tree's arrival, and he chose to help the dragon rather than flee from the battle entirely. This detail is small, but it is characteristic. In the Dragon Ball Z films, Gohan's bravery was consistently motivated by something specific and immediate, someone in front of him who needed help, rather than by abstract heroic principle. He did not decide to be brave, he simply responded to what was in front of him. The fourth Dragon Ball Z film is sometimes called Lord Slug in English, and in Japan it was Super Saiyajin da Son Goku. Son Goku is the Super Saiyan. That second title is significant and misleading, and part of a complicated story about what was happening in the series at the time of the film's production. The film released on March 9, 1991, and by that point, the broadcast series had already introduced the concept of the Super Saiyan transformation, had introduced it spectacularly during the battle on Namek, in a sequence that had become one of the defining moments of the franchise. But the fourth film was written and produced on a timeline that did not perfectly align with the broadcast. The transformation Goku underwent in this film, a surge of enormous power accompanied by a change in his Ki's character, was presented somewhat ambiguously, leaving open the question of whether it was the same Super Saiyan transformation viewers had seen on Namek or something slightly different. This ambiguity has been discussed at length by people who love the franchise carefully. The most honest reading of the film's production context is that the Super Saiyajin in the title was aspirational. The filmmakers were working toward the transformation that the series was building, and the result was something that pointed in the same direction without quite arriving at the same destination. Lord Slug himself was a powerful and ancient Namekian, a Super Namek, a member of a different branch of Namekian society than the fighters and Dragon Clan members that Goku and his friends had encountered on Namek. He was old, and he had the ability to shed his age by removing his skin, regenerating into a younger, larger, more powerful form, which was presented with a particular graphic intensity that the film's director Mitsuo Hashimoto brought to several of the film sequences. Slug had also gathered a group of followers, including a memorable pair named Angela, Medamacha, and Wings, each possessing abilities suited to their design. The film built toward a confrontation that placed Goku in the position of fighting someone who seemed genuinely capable of outlasting him, and whose defeat required both Piccolo's intervention, who tore off his own ears to disrupt the technique of Gohan's that Slug found painful, and the particular quality of energy that Goku could gather when pushed to the absolute edge of his capacity. The fourth film is not frequently cited as the strongest entry in the Dragon Ball Z theatrical canon. Its villain, while visually distinctive, does not carry the narrative depth of the series' best antagonists, and its story follows a relatively familiar structure without the particular emotional shading that the best entries achieve. But it has its pleasures. The animation quality was high for its production period. The climactic battle carried genuine physical weight, and the relationship between Goku and Piccolo, which the film used thoughtfully, continued to develop the particular texture of two people who were not exactly friends and who would fight alongside each other until one of them could no longer stand. The fifth Dragon Ball Z film arrived in theaters on July 20th, 1991, and it is called Cooler's Revenge in English. In Japan, its title was Tobikiri no Saikyo Tai Saikyo, The Incredible Mightiest versus Mightiest, It introduced a character who would return for one of the series' most inventively structured films, and who remains one of the theatrical tradition's most enduring antagonists. Cooler was Frieza's older brother. The film established this in its opening sequence, the sequence set years in the past, showing the moment when a Saiyan infant named Kakarado was launched from planet Vegeta in a small pod. Aimed at a distant planet, the pod passed through the space controlled by Cooler's forces, and Cooler's soldiers moved to intercept it. Coolers stopped them. He was not interested, he said, in cleaning up his brother's mess. If Frieza had chosen to destroy the Saiyans but missed one pod, that was Frieza's concern. He turned away, and the pod continued, and the child inside it landed on Earth and became Goku. Years later, with Frieza defeated by a Super Saiyan on Namek, Cooler arrived on Earth with his elite unit, the Armored Squadron, consisting of Salza, Naze, and Dor, with the stated purpose of restoring his family's honor. He felt, he explained, that Goku's defeat of Frieza was an insult to the lineage they shared, and that this insult required a response. There is something interesting in Cooler's framing. He had let the pod go. He had chosen, in that early moment, not to act, and that choice had led, through a long and indirect chain, to everything that followed. He blamed Goku for a consequence that had its root in his own decision. This was not a contradiction he acknowledged or even appeared to recognize. It was simply how he thought about the world. An older sibling's particular brand of resentment, wrapped in the armor of honor and family obligation, serving a grievance that was really about something much more personal and much harder to articulate. Cooler was physically larger than Frieza, and his final form, his transformation into a mode that Frieza had never achieved, was presented as a genuine step beyond what the series had established as Frieza's ceiling. The battle that resulted was one of the film's strongest stretches, animated with particular energy and spatial clarity. Goku's transformation into a Super Saiyan in this film felt earned, felt like it was being used as a genuine narrative tool rather than simply as a visual spectacle. And the exchange of force between two combatants whose power existed at a scale that should have been incomprehensible was made, through very careful direction, to feel concrete and physical and real. The film resolved with a kamehameha of enormous force sent toward a structure that Cooler had been using to concentrate power, and Cooler himself, launched into space, driven toward the sun, fell into a trajectory that the sixth film would eventually continue. The sixth Dragon Ball Z film is called The Return of Cooler in English, and in Japan it was Geki Totsu, Hayaku Oku Power no Senshitachi, clashing 100 billion powerful warriors. It arrived on March 7, 1992, and it was structurally the most inventive film the tradition had produced up to that point. Cooler, defeated at the end of the fifth film and launched toward the sun, had not died in the way that the fifth film had implied. Instead, he had been absorbed, his biological data captured and incorporated by a vast mechanical entity called the Big Geet Star. This was a machine of alien origin that traveled through space, absorbing dead planets and biological organisms for raw material, reconstructing them and incorporating them into itself. Cooler had been absorbed in this way, and the result was a new Cooler. A Cooler made entirely of metal, with all the power of the original and none of the biological vulnerabilities that had contributed to his defeat. The Big Geet Star had arrived at New Namekian, the planet where the surviving Namekian people had resettled after the destruction of their original home, and had begun draining the planet and capturing the Namekians to use as raw material. Dende, who by this point had become important to the group in the broadcast series, sent a message through the Dragon Balls, and the response team, Goku, Vegeta, and the others, traveled to New Namek. What followed demonstrated the film's structural ambition. Multiple copies of Cooler, identical, synchronized, all drawing from the same central system, could be deployed against the heroes simultaneously. Defeating one accomplished nothing because another was already being manufactured. The central intelligence was Cooler himself, distributed across the entire mechanical mass of the Big Geet Star, and dealing with him required dealing with the source rather than the manifestations. If you're still awake halfway through, maybe subscribe before you drift off, and tell me what time it is where you're watching from. The resolution required Goku and Vegeta to work in parallel rather than together, each fighting in different parts of the same structure. With different methods and different styles and the deeply reluctant coordination of two people who respected each other's capacity without particularly enjoying each other's company, Vegeta's role in the sixth film was a significant part of what made it memorable. He had not yet made the transition that the broadcast series was slowly and carefully developing. He was still the Vegeta who had arrived on Earth as an antagonist, whose pride was a barrier rather than a foundation, whose cooperation was always conditional and always slightly grudging. But the film used this version of Vegeta with intelligence, allowing his particular approach to the situation to be both accurate and characteristically him. The defeat of the Big Gita star involved a shared effort that neither Goku nor Vegeta would likely have described as a team effort afterward, but which was, in the most practical sense, exactly that. The system was destroyed. Cooler's consciousness, distributed across the metal and now without a housing, ended. New Namek was saved. The sixth film has a particular technical achievement worth noting. Its animation quality represented one of the higher points in the Dragon Ball Z theatrical tradition. The mechanical design of the Big Get star and its constructions required a level of detail and consistency that was demanding, and the film's animators met that demand with notable care. The battle sequences in this entry have a clarity and a weight that holds up well even viewed decades later, when the standards of comparison are much higher. The seventh Dragon Ball Z film holds a particular place in the theatrical tradition. It is called Super Android 13 in English, and its Japanese title was Kyokugen Battle, Sandai Super Saiyajin, Extreme Battle, 3 Super Saiyans. It was released on July 11, 1992, and it was the first film to feature all 3 of the Super Saiyan transformations that were active in the broadcast series at the time: Goku, Gohan, and future Trunks, which gave it an energy of accumulation and display. The film began with a shopping trip, which established immediately the particular tone of its early passages. Goku and his family, and several of the other central characters, were in a city going about ordinary life when Android 14 and 15 appeared and began attacking specifically and single-mindedly targeting Goku. This was the film's central mystery for its first act. Why these newly appeared androids, never seen before, were interested exclusively in Goku's destruction. The answer came with the arrival of Android 13, a larger, more powerfully built figure than 14 or 15. Whose purpose and origin were quickly revealed. All 3 were the creation of Dr. Gero, the scientist whose quest to destroy Goku had defined the Android/Cell saga of the broadcast series. These 3 had existed in Gero's computer systems, his designs not quite completed before his death, and the computer had eventually finished their construction and activated them with the same directive that had animated every android Gero had built: find Son Goku and kill him. The battle moved through the city, into its streets and across its buildings, and then shifted as the film found its actual setting, a mountainous, Arctic region where the scale of the fighting could expand to match the power levels involved. Trunks arrived, Vegeta arrived. The 3 Super Saiyans fought 3 adversaries, and the early stages of the film were structured around these parallel engagements, each pair in their own space, each fight carrying its own particular dynamic. Android 13's final form, achieved after absorbing the core units of the defeated 14 and 15, was the film's central visual and narrative escalation. He became something different, larger, darker, covered in a particular kind of energy that had incorporated the power sources of the other 2 androids into himself. The transformation recalled, in some ways, the cell of the broadcast series, an entity reaching its most powerful form through absorption, but it arrived through a different mechanism and served a different story purpose. This 13 was not an aspiring perfection. He was a weapon at full activation, Goku's defeat of him required a spirit bomb, a Genki Dama formed in specific and unusual circumstances, requiring Goku to enter a meditative state while his allies kept 13 occupied, and then requiring Goku to absorb the spirit bomb himself rather than launching it, incorporating the collected energy into his own body for the final strike. This was a creative use of the technique, expanding its possibilities in ways the broadcast series had not yet demonstrated, and it served the film's central visual idea well. The eighth Dragon Ball Z film is Broly, the legendary Super Saiyan in English, and in Japanese it was Moetsukiro, Nessen Ressen Cho Gekisen, Burn Up, a red-hot, raging super fierce. It was released on March 6, 1993, and it introduced a character who would become, over the decades that followed, one of the most culturally significant antagonists in Dragon Ball Z's history, not through canon placement, since Broly never appeared in the manga or the broadcast series, but through something else, the particular force of the impression he made, and the way that impression was received, and what the audience did with it. Broly was a Saiyan born on the same day as Goku. His power level at birth had been extraordinary, high enough that the records from that time suggested he would become something unprecedented. Something that the Saiyan caste system, which valued and organized power with careful precision, did not quite have a category for. King Vegeta, the father of Prince Vegeta, ruler of the Saiyan race, had seen the infant's power level and had ordered the child killed because a Saiyan born with that much power was a variable that a king could not comfortably control. The sentence was carried out, or appeared to be carried out. Broly's father, Paragus, survived and rescued his son, and both of them escaped planet Vegeta. They were in space when Frieza destroyed it, and they survived that destruction as well. The film began with the surviving Saiyans locating the Saiyan prince and his companions and bringing them to a planet that Paragus claimed to be developing, with Broly serving as its guardian. The situation was carefully arranged. Paragus had built everything around one central goal. He wanted Vegeta to witness his son's power and to be destroyed by it in revenge for the king's order that had nearly ended Broly's life decades before. The film's early passages were quiet in a particular way, the kind of quiet that precedes something that cannot be stopped. Paragus was calm and deferential and clearly hiding something, and the architecture of what he was hiding was revealed slowly, each piece of the structure becoming visible slightly before the film was ready to name it. Goku, upon meeting Broly for the first time, experienced an instinctive unease that he could not explain, a recognition at some level below language, some memory not of the mind but of the body, the response of an infant who had once shared a nursery with a child whose crying had filled every waking moment. They had been born on the same day, they had been placed next to each other. Broly's constant screaming had lodged in Goku's earliest unconscious memory as something associated with threat, with discomfort, with the feeling that something enormous and uncontrollable was very close. This origin was one of the film's stranger creative decisions, and it has been discussed with great seriousness and considerable amusement by people who love Dragon Ball Z closely. On its face, it was absurd, a villain whose hatred for the hero was rooted in crying, but beneath the absurdity was something worth sitting with. The idea that the earliest experiences of a living creature, experiences so early they predate anything like conscious memory, could leave marks that lasted a lifetime? Broly hated Goku with a completeness and a passion that no rational accounting could fully explain. The film was not entirely sure whether to treat this as a joke or a tragedy, and the tension between those two registers was part of what made the character so persistently interesting. Broly's legendary Super Saiyan form was the film's central visual achievement. It was distinct from the standard Super Saiyan transformation. The hair remained a pale green rather than the gold of the standard form, and the energy surrounding him had a different quality, more diffuse and more enormous, radiating rather than concentrating. He was large, physically larger than in his base form, and the weight of his presence on screen was one of the strongest achievements of the film's animation staff. Watching him on a theater screen, must have been an experience with a specific physical dimension to it. The sense that something was being shown to you that existed at a scale your body could feel. The battle against Broly was, uniquely among the Dragon Ball Z theatrical films, a fight in which Goku appeared to be genuinely outmatched in a sustained and non-reversible way. The film was structured so that Vegeta, who was normally among the strongest of the group, was paralyzed by Broly's presence in a way that had no obvious precedent. He could not bring himself to fight. He stood, and Broly walked toward him, and Vegeta's pride and his courage and all the qualities that defined him could not move his body. This was not cruelty on the film's part. It was an attempt to convey scale, to show, through the reaction of someone the audience knew to be immensely powerful, just how far beyond that power Broly existed. Goku's victory required gathering the energy of his four companions, each of them transmitting a portion of their power through physical contact, each of them giving what they could, and transforming that shared offering into a single focused strike that penetrated Broly's defenses and ended the battle. It was a collective victory presented as an individual moment, which was a choice that reflected something true about how the Dragon Ball Z films tended to understand heroism. The hero was the one who gathered the energy and delivered it, but the energy came from everyone who believed in him. The ninth Dragon Ball Z film is Bojack Unbound in English, and in Japan it was Ginga Giri Giri, Butobase Goko-san, Galaxy on the Brink, The Incredible Mightiest vs. Mightiest. It was released on July 10, 1993, and it holds a distinctive place in the theatrical canon for several reasons, one of which was in front of the camera, and one of which was behind it. Behind the camera, Broly was the ninth film's contemporary in production terms, and the two films were released in the same theatrical event, paired together. As the Dragon Ball Z films were sometimes paired at the Toei Summer Festival, this meant audiences who saw the ninth film in theaters had often just finished watching the eighth, and the emotional register of the transition between them was a particular kind of experience. In front of the camera, this was the film in which Gohan, not Goku, was the primary hero. Goku was dead, killed by Cell in the broadcast series, having sacrificed himself to teleport a self-destructing Cell away from Earth, and the film was set in a timeline where Goku's death had occurred, which meant that the central figure of the Dragon Ball Z theatrical tradition was absent, and the story had to find its footing without him. It did this through a galaxy-wide fighting tournament organized by Gyoshu, a wealthy and somewhat exuberant figure who had purchased the rights to the event. The tournament was held on Earth, and it was intended as spectacle, a series of battles between strong fighters from around the universe, staged for entertainment. Gohan, still a teenager, entered with his friends. What neither they nor the organizers knew was that a faction of extraordinarily powerful fighters had infiltrated the tournament with entirely different purposes. Bojack was the leader of this faction, a large teal-skinned figure of immense power, accompanied by four followers, Bido, Bujin, Kogu, and Zanya. They were, the film established, beings who had been sealed away by the four Kaioshin, the supreme Kai's divine figures who governed the universe at a level above even King Kai, because they had posed a genuine threat to cosmic order. They had been freed when Goku, using instant transmission to teleport Cell away from the Earth, had briefly passed through and disrupted the dimension where they were confined. They were free, they were powerful, and they were hungry for destruction in the specific, complete way of things that have been contained against their will for a very long time. The film moved efficiently through the tournament structure, dispatching the other fighters with a directness that made clear these were not characters who were interested in spectacle. They were interested in outcomes. Krillin, Trunks, and Yamcha each faced Bojack's followers, and each found themselves in conditions that their power alone was insufficient to resolve. This was not the film being dismissive of these characters. It was the film calibrating the scale of the threat, establishing clearly that this was something that had exceeded the capabilities of everyone present except the one figure the film was building toward. Gohan's transformation into Super Saiyan 2, the form he had achieved during the Cell games, and which the broadcast series had presented as an event of enormous significance, was the film's central escalation. The trigger, as in the broadcast series, was not abstract determination, but immediate and specific anger. Watching someone he cared about being hurt, and reaching the point where his endurance of that sight was no longer possible. The transformation had the same quality it had carried in the broadcast series, something slightly different from the standard Super Saiyan ascension, calmer in its delivery but more complete. The energy surrounding him becoming something that did not have quite the same relationship to effort that the earlier forms had suggested. The battle that followed was, by the standards of the theatrical tradition, one of the most physically striking. Bojack was designed with a final transformation of his own, a shift into a gold-scaled form that concentrated his power into a smaller, denser package, and the exchange between his full power and Gohan's full power was animated with considerable force. Goku's brief appearance, allowed one moment outside the afterlife to speak to his son, was a choice that the film's director Yoshihiro Ueda used economically, not overextending the moment, but allowing it to land with the weight it carried. The 10th Dragon Ball Z film is called Broly, Second Coming in English, and its Japanese title was Kikenna Futari, Supa Senshiwa Nemurenai, The Dangerous Duo, Super Warriors Never Rest. It released on March 12, 1994, and it was the direct sequel to the 8th film, the second entry in what would become a trilogy of theatrical stories centered on the legendary Super Saiyan. The film opened 7 years after the events of the 8th film. Broly had survived the battle that appeared to end him, survived through the specific mechanism of a Saiyan's capacity to endure damage that should be fatal, and through the particular coldness of space, which had preserved him in a frozen state on a remote planet while time passed and the universe continued without him. He woke, and the first person he encountered, arriving with Goten and Trunks on a small adventure of their own, was Goten, Goku's second son, born after Goku's death, who bore a striking resemblance to his father. Goten's resemblance to Goku became the trigger that the film needed. The sight of a small boy who looked like Kakaroto was enough to reactivate everything that had driven Broly in the 8th film. And the film moved from that reactivation toward the confrontation with the directness that characterized the strongest entries in the theatrical tradition. Goten and Trunks, both young, both strong by any conventional measure but clearly outmatched, fought with the enthusiasm of children who did not fully understand the scale of what they were facing. Gohan arrived and attempted to hold Broly while the younger boys recovered, and the film built its middle section around the question of whether the same tactics that had worked before could work again, in a different configuration of fighters and with a different understanding of what Broly was. The film's resolution came through a Kamehameha, a collaborative technique that drew on the energy of Gohan, Goten, and the spirit of Goku, the latter transmitted through the connection between father and son that the Dragon Ball Z films had consistently treated as a channel capable of bridging even the distance between the living and the dead. The technique was one of the film's most visually deliberate sequences, the three sources of energy converging with a care for geometry and light that made it feel ceremonial. Broly, struck by this combined force, was carried into the sun, an ending that paralleled deliberately the ending of the 5th film, and that left the question of his ultimate fate with the same degree of ambiguity. This ambiguity was the 10th film's gift to the tradition. By not closing the door fully, it preserved the possibility of continuation, and the audience that had connected most strongly with Broly as a character, that had found in him something that the broadcast series villains did not quite provide, was left with the knowledge that the story was not necessarily over. The 11th Dragon Ball Z film is called Bio Broly in English, and in Japan it was Supa Senshi Gekiha, Katsu no wa Oreda, Super Warrior Defeat, I'm the One Who'll Win. Released on July 9, 1994, it completed the theatrical Broly trilogy through a mechanism that was, in conception, notably different from the two films that preceded it. The film introduced a character named Jaguar, a wealthy man with a grudge against Mr. Satan, the character who had claimed public credit for defeating Cell, and who existed in the broadcast series as both comic relief and a surprising source of genuine human courage. Jaguar had arranged for his own collection of bio-warriors, artificially created fighters using biological templates, and had, through a process that the film established in its early passages, acquired genetic material from Broly. The scientist in his employ had used this material to create a biological copy of Broly, preserved in a tank and not yet activated. The bio-warriors were released. The biological Broly was released, and what emerged was something that shared Broly's extraordinary power, but without the coherence that had made the original dangerous in a specific and directed way. The biological copy was formless in a way its template had not been, ultimately dissolving into a liquid state that spread outward and threatened everything it encountered, consuming and converting biological matter indiscriminately, a threat that had changed in character from the original and required a different kind of response. The film's protagonists were primarily Trunks and Goten, with Android 18 playing a significant supporting role in a way that the theatrical tradition had not used her before. She was practical and capable and not particularly interested in heroic posturing, which gave the film's middle section a different texture from the preceding entries. The presence of a fighter who approached the situation with efficiency rather than emotion, and who provided a grounding quality to the chaos around her. The resolution involved a flooding of the facility, seawater introduced in sufficient volume to neutralize the biological material. And the ultimate fate of the copy was the kind of ending that fit the film's particular character, not a dramatic final strike, but a thorough and practical elimination. Bio Broly is not frequently cited as the strongest entry in the Dragon Ball Z theatrical canon, and the assessment that it was the weakest entry in the Broly sub-series is one that the film's own energies do not entirely resist. It was a product of the summer of 1994, made quickly in the cycle of the theatrical tradition, and its invention was deployed primarily in the technical details of the biological threat rather than in the narrative architecture around it. But it had its own particular pleasures, and it served as the conclusion of a trilogy that had, at its peak, delivered some of the theatrical tradition's most powerful moments. The 12th Dragon Ball Z film is called Fusion Reborn in English, and in Japan it was Fukatsu no Fusion, Goku to Vegeta, Revival of Fusion, Goku and Vegeta. It was released on March 4th, 1995, and it is frequently cited as one of the strongest entries in the entire theatrical tradition, a film that found in the flexibility of a non-canon setting the space to do something the broadcast series could not easily accomplish. The film's inciting event was a catastrophic failure in the afterlife. A young worker, and only responsible for managing the souls of the newly dead and the purification of evil energy, had been neglecting his duties. The machine he managed had accumulated a vast quantity of unprocessed evil energy, and when that energy reached critical mass, it erupted. The rupture tore a hole between dimensions. The dead returned to the living world, not selectively, not through the Dragon Balls, but wholesale every spirit that had been held in the afterlife, suddenly free to walk among the living. This included, notably, Adolf Hitler, who appeared in a brief and bizarre sequence that was treated with less gravity than a historical figure of that particular infamy might seem to warrant, but which was part of the film's general willingness to be strange and inventive in ways that made room for Goku's response to operate at full energy. The other consequence of the rupture was the creation of Janemba. This was the being formed from the concentrated evil energy when it finally took a shape, a large, round, yellow figure with a childlike effect and an extraordinary degree of raw power. He had no coherent malice and no particular agenda. He was simply what happened when every unit of unprocessed evil in existence found a temporary vessel, and the vessel began to interact with the world. The film's first Janemba, in his initial round yellow form, was dispatched by Goku with a quality of ease that was, in itself, a story choice. This form was not the point. What followed the first defeat was a compression and intensification, the evil energy concentrating into a smaller, more coherent shape. The second Janemba was different in every way from the first. Dark red, precisely proportioned, carrying a sword that could open portals in space. He was fast in a way that was difficult to track, capable of manipulating dimensional space in ways that made the standard approaches to combat less immediately applicable, and he was patient in the way that something with no particular goal except existence tends to be patient. Vegeta's arrival in the film, Vegeta in the Afterlife, Defeated and Dead, was handled with the particular care that the best Dragon Ball Z theatrical entries brought to his character. He had pride enough to resist what Goku was proposing. He had intelligence enough to recognize when his pride was operating against his practical interests. The fusion dance, Potara was not available in this context, required two people of nearly equal power and height and weight to perform a synchronized sequence of movements, and the result, if performed correctly, was a single fused individual who combined both contributors into something greater than either. Gogeta, the fusion of Goku and Vegeta using the fusion dance, appeared in the theatrical tradition before he appeared in the broadcast series, and the version in this film was used with an economy and confidence that suggested the filmmakers understood exactly how much weight this moment carried. He was efficient. He was calm. He defeated Janemba through a technique that purified rather than destroyed, the Stardust Breaker, an attack that separated and cleansed the evil energy animating the villain, returning the souls it had corrupted to their proper state. It was a fitting resolution for a villain who was at root a purification problem. The work that had been neglected was completed, and the disruption ended. The 12th film is notable as well for what happened around the Gogeta sequence. Vegeta's arc in this film was one of the more emotionally resonant passages in the theatrical tradition's treatment of his character. The moment when he agreed to perform the fusion dance, agreed to it despite everything his pride resisted about the idea of merging with another person, of temporarily ceasing to be himself, was handled quietly, without celebration, in the way that the most significant character moments in Dragon Ball Z were sometimes handled. The 13th Dragon Ball Z film is called Wrath of the Dragon in English, and in Japan it was Ryuken Bakuhatsu, Goku ga Yaraneba Dare ga Yaru, Dragon Fist Explosion. If Goku can't do it, who will? It was released on July 15, 1995, and it was the final entry in the theatrical tradition before the franchise moved into the Dragon Ball GT era and the nature of the theatrical films changed accordingly. The film introduced two significant elements. The first was Tapion, a young hero from a distant world called Konuts, who had been imprisoned in a music box for 700 years, sealed inside as the only way to prevent the release of a monster named Hirudegarn. The second was Hirudegarn himself, a creature of colossal scale, the upper and lower halves of which had been sealed inside two separate beings, Tapion and his younger brother Minosha, whose fate provided the film's emotional foundation. Tapion was, in his design and his story, one of the theatrical tradition's most carefully drawn secondary characters. He played a musical instrument, an ocarina, and the music served a functional purpose. It maintained his control over the creature sealed within him, kept Hirudegarn's upper half dormant. He was thousands of years removed from everything he had known, revived in a future he had not prepared for, carrying a burden that had no resolution he could see. He was not interested in being helped. He was not interested in company. He understood that what he was preserving inside himself was too dangerous to risk through any failure of his concentration, and he was willing to endure the isolation that preservation required. Hoi, a small, treacherous figure who had been responsible for releasing Tapion and who had misrepresented his purposes, was the film's secondary antagonist, and his machinations served the purpose of bringing the two halves of Hirudegarn together in the film's third act. The creature combined was enormous, one of the largest single antagonists in the theatrical tradition, and its battle against Goku and his companions occupied the film's final section with a physicality that the production brought to with considerable resources. The resolution introduced the Dragon Fist technique, Ryuken, literally the Dragon Fist, a move in which Goku's ki took the shape of a golden dragon as it extended outward, which had not appeared in the broadcast series at that point and which gave the film a climactic visual that was distinctly its own. The dragon image, Shenron-shaped, emanating from Goku's fist, the visual combining the series' oldest symbol with its central hero at full extension, was the theatrical tradition's final image of Goku at his greatest reach, and the choice to end the theatrical canon on that image, with that technique, felt deliberate. Tapion's connection to Trunks, the way the film developed a genuine relationship between them over its running time, Tapion slowly allowing himself to trust someone in a world that was not his own, was handled with more warmth than such connections sometimes receive in films of this kind. The moment when Tapion gave Trunks his ocarina, before returning to the time when he was meant to exist, was the film's emotional conclusion, and it landed with the kind of quiet completeness that the best Dragon Ball Z theatrical entries consistently achieved. There are things that all 13 films share, and there are things that each film held only for itself. What they shared was the pace of their storytelling, which was calibrated to a theatrical audience who had come specifically to see this, who had chosen this experience among other available experiences, who had bought a ticket and found a seat and were ready. The broadcast series had the luxury of time. A story that could unfold across 30 episodes could explore its corners and take its detours and allow its quieter passages to breathe without apology. The films had 45 minutes, sometimes 60, and within that space they had to establish an antagonist, build a threat, develop an emotional situation, reach a climax, and provide a resolution that felt earned rather than rushed. The best entries in the theatrical tradition managed this through compression without sacrifice, through an understanding that a well-constructed villain, given 15 minutes of screen time and used correctly, could carry more weight than a poorly constructed one given 100. Broly worked because his tragedy and his anger were legible almost immediately, before his full power was revealed, before the backstory was completely established. Yanemba worked because the concept animating him, unprocessed evil taking shape, was both visually inventive and emotionally coherent. Cooler worked because he carried in every moment the particular kind of resentment that comes from choosing not to act and spending years reconstructing that choice as the right one. What each film held for itself was its specific moment, the specific capabilities of the animation staff working on it, the specific energy of the cast and the director and the writers who had, for a few months, made this one film their central concern. The Dragon Ball Z theatrical tradition was a collective work, produced over a decade by different combinations of people who shared a common attachment to the material and who brought different qualities and different ambitions to each entry. The films were made quickly. They were released seasonally. They were consumed in theaters by audiences who were young and enthusiastic and who had already been living with these characters for years through the broadcast series. They were not, in most cases, the primary work. They were supplementary, adjacent, existing in the space alongside the manga and the broadcast rather than in place of it. But in that adjacent space, they found things that the main narrative could not always reach, and the best of them left impressions that lasted in the people who saw them in a way that was not diminished by their distance from canon. The theatrical tradition also deserves consideration from the perspective of what it gave the production staff and the animation teams. Dragon Ball Z was one of the most demanding productions in the history of Japanese television animation. The weekly schedule, the length of the broadcast run, the scale and complexity of the action sequences required, all of these placed continuous pressure on the people making it. The theatrical films, which were produced in parallel to the broadcast series, represented an opportunity for the highest skilled animators to do work that would be seen on a large screen in a theatrical setting with a somewhat longer production schedule and a substantially larger budget per minute of animation. The impact of this is visible when you watch the films closely. The movement quality in the best theatrical entries is consistently higher than the average quality of the broadcast series. The weight and momentum of the fights, The detail in the character animation, the composition of the shots, this was not an accident. It was the natural consequence of giving skilled animators time and resources and a canvas that would be projected large enough for every detail to matter. The theatrical tradition also gave the Dragon Ball Z franchise something that the broadcast series could not always provide: endings. The broadcast series, following the manga, was committed to continuation, to the next saga, the next threat, the next level of power. It could not end because the story was not over. The films, each one self-contained, could finish. They could resolve their central conflicts with a completeness that television rarely permits. Each film's antagonist was defeated fully with no ambiguity about the outcome. Each film's emotional situation reached its conclusion. The credits rolled and the thing was done, and the audience could leave the theater with the particular satisfaction of a complete story told at a pace they had chosen. This completeness is part of what makes the films so available for repeat viewing. They do not require the viewer to hold 100 hours of context in mind. They build their own context within themselves, borrowing what they need from the shared world of the series and establishing what else is necessary, and they conclude in a way that can be fully appreciated without reference to what comes before or after. This is a structural virtue that the films earn through their constraints, and it is one of the quieter achievements of the theatrical tradition as a whole. The experience of the theatrical tradition differs substantially depending on when a person first encounters it. For those who saw these films in Japanese theaters during their original runs, who arrived in the summer or spring of 1990 or 92 and settled into their seats alongside other children who had been watching the same series on television every week, the films existed in a context of shared enthusiasm and shared familiarity that is not quite reproducible later. The antagonists were surprises. The transformations were genuine escalations in a story that was still actively unfolding. The appearance of Vegeta in the 6th film, or the first glimpse of the fused Gogeta in the 12th, landed in theaters with a force that could only fully be felt by someone who was discovering these moments for the first time. For those who encountered the films later, through home video or through the various international distribution arrangements that eventually brought them to audiences in North America, Europe, and elsewhere, the experience was different but not diminished. The films remained coherent, complete, watchable outside their original context. They carried the energy of their production rather than the energy of their release, and the energy of their production was, at its best, very high indeed. The international reception of the Dragon Ball Z films added another layer to their history. The English dubbing of the films, initially by Animation beginning in the late 1990s, introduced them to the North American audience that had come to the series through the broadcast run and was hungry for more. The dubs were themselves a form of adaptation, bringing the films into a different cultural register while trying to preserve their essential qualities, and the voice actors who inhabited these roles, primarily the cast that had established themselves in the broadcast series, brought to the theatrical versions the same character knowledge they had developed across hundreds of episodes. The cultural weight of the Dragon Ball Z films in North America became particularly visible through the tournament circuit, the early internet fan community, and eventually the streaming era, when the entire theatrical catalog became accessible in a way it had never been during the original theatrical run. Broly's status as a beloved figure, a character who had never appeared in the manga and who carried no canonical weight in the series' official story, was primarily a product of this international reception and of the repeated viewings that home video and streaming made possible. The character connected with audiences in a way that was not entirely predicted by the original context of his creation, and that connection accumulated over years into something that eventually had to be acknowledged. Dragon Ball Super Broly, released in December of 2018, directed by Tatsuya Nagamine, with a screenplay co-written by Akira Toriyama himself, was the ultimate acknowledgement of that accumulated connection. The film took the character that the theatrical tradition had created, brought him into full canonical status, and provided a version of his story that retained the essential elements of the theatrical Broly, his power, his origin, his relationship to Goku and Vegeta, while reconfiguring the details into something that Toriyama had approved and shaped. The film was, among other things, an act of recognition. The theatrical tradition had created something that mattered enough to be welcomed into the main story. There is a quality that the Dragon Ball Z theatrical tradition had in common with all storytelling that is made under the discipline of constraint. The best of it was tighter than it might otherwise have been, and that tightness was a feature rather than a limitation. 45 minutes does not allow for digressions. It does not allow for the kind of extended power-up sequences that the broadcast series sometimes employed, in which the energy of a moment was sustained across multiple episodes. The transformation approached and approached again before finally completing. The films had to make their moments land on the first pass, fully, with the complete weight they were intended to carry. This discipline produced work that had a different rhythm from the series that surrounded it. The films moved. They established, they escalated, they resolved, and they did all three with a directness that was itself a form of respect for the audience, a recognition that the people in the theater were there because they loved the story, and that what they deserved was the story being told as well as it could be told in the time available. The 13 films span a creative period in Dragon Ball Z's history from the end of the Saiyan saga to the beginning of the Cell aftermath, a period of approximately 5 years, during which the series was at its broadest popular reach and the production infrastructure around it was most fully developed. By the time the 13th film was released in July of 1995, the broadcast series was approaching the conclusion of the Buu saga, and the shape of the franchise's future was beginning to become clearer. The theatrical tradition as it had existed, tied to the Toei seasonal festivals, released twice yearly, centered on the core Z-era cast, was winding down. Dragon Ball GT would arrive in 1996, and with it a different set of priorities and a different approach to the theatrical format. But the 13 films remained. They stayed, and they were watched, and they were rewatched, and they were passed between friends and siblings and classmates and neighbors in the various physical formats that made that kind of sharing possible. They became part of how a generation understood Dragon Ball Z, part of the accumulated texture of a franchise that had become, for many people who grew up watching it, something close to a formative experience. The villains of the Dragon Ball Z theatrical tradition formed their own ecology, their own system of relationships and contrasts, and accidental conversations across the decade of the film's production. Garlic Jr. was the beginning, a villain who achieved his goal, who got the immortality he wanted, and whose defeat required finding a different kind of solution. He could not be killed. He had to be contained. There was something in this premise, the idea that some victories are incomplete in ways that persist, that the theatrical tradition would return to in different forms. Willow asked what intelligence was worth without a body. Turles asked what strength was worth without ambition. Slug demonstrated what happened when power had outlasted its purpose and now existed only to perpetuate itself. Cooler demonstrated that resentment and pride could be given the structure of an entire empire, and that the empire was still just resentment and pride. The android villains, the big Gite Star Cooler, Android 13 and his components, the biological Broly, were explorations of what technology could do with the templates provided by organic life. They were questions about copies and originals, about whether a recreation could carry the essential qualities of the thing it was recreating, about what was lost in translation when biology became machinery or machinery became biology. Broly was the theatrical tradition's deepest exploration of power as a thing that could exist independently of any of the qualities usually associated with it: intelligence, ambition, cruelty, purpose. He had power and he had rage, and the combination was sufficient, without any other qualities to constitute a genuine threat. This simplicity was, paradoxically, what made him complex, because the question of what to do with power that had no coherent purpose and no meaningful goal was not a simple question, and the films that centered on him did not pretend otherwise. Bojack was rage at cosmic containment, the particular quality of anger that comes from being imprisoned not by any personal antagonist, but by an order that predates you and that would rather you not exist at all. Yanemba was the shape that evil took when it was given a moment to take any shape it chose, and it chose something that barely noticed the people it was threatening. Hero Degarn was scale itself, separated from purpose, a force of destruction that did not decide to be destructive but simply was. These were not all equally deep explorations. Some of the films did more with their villains than others, but the tradition as a whole demonstrated a consistent interest in the question of what power was for, what it meant, what it required, what it did to the people who held it and the people who faced it. This was the same question that the broadcast series was exploring across hundreds of episodes and several decades of production, and the theatrical films were not separate from that exploration. They were part of it, working within it, contributing to it in the particular way that a shorter and more concentrated form can contribute to a longer and more expansive one. The music of the Dragon Ball Z theatrical tradition deserves its own moment of attention, because it was one of the elements that most consistently distinguished the theatrical experience from the broadcast series. The films employed Shunsuke Kikuchi, who also composed the broadcast series soundtrack, and the work he produced for the theatrical entries benefited from the same expanded resources that lifted the animation quality. The theatrical scores had more room, more instruments, more space for thematic development, more opportunity to build toward the kind of musical climaxes that action sequences of the film's scale required. There were pieces of music in the Dragon Ball Z films that became, for the audiences who encountered them in theaters, the emotional foundation of those films' most significant moments. Themes that anchored the first appearance of a villain, or the development of a friendship, or the final exchange of a climactic battle. The brass arrangements that characterized the more intense action sequences had a quality of weight that fit the visual language of the films well. They were not subtle, and they were not trying to be. They were designed to amplify and extend the emotional impact of what the animation was showing. And in the best cases, they succeeded in this with a completeness that made it hard to imagine the images without them. The quieter passages of the films, the moments of dialogue, of character development, of the careful building of an emotional situation, were served by different materials, piano pieces, string arrangements, the occasional passage of pure silence that the theatrical setting allowed in a way that television could not always manage. The contrast between the quieter and more intense passages was part of how the films were paced, and the music was a primary tool for navigating that contrast. The Dragon Ball Z theatrical tradition was, ultimately, a gift, a series of gifts, one per theatrical season for 5 years, given to audiences who had chosen to receive them. Each film was an occasion, a reason to gather, a promise that for the next 45 minutes or 60 minutes, the characters they had been living with, week by week, would get to do what those characters did best. On the largest available screen, with the full resources of a theatrical production behind them, the best films transcended their occasion and became things that endured. The films that did not quite reach the heights of the strongest entries were still genuine attempts, made with care by people who understood the material and wanted to honor it. None of the 13 was made carelessly. None of them was made without love for the characters and the story, love for the audience who would receive it, love for the craft of animation and for the particular craft of telling a story at compressed scale without sacrificing what made the story worth telling. They exist now in a different relationship to their original context than they did when they were first released. The theatrical occasions that produced them are long past, and the children who attended those occasions are adults, and the films are available in ways that make the theatrical experience impossible to replicate. But the films themselves remain complete, watchable, carrying still the energy of the people who made them and the enthusiasm of the audience that first received them. They are 13 windows into a particular moment in a franchise that has continued long past their production period. And looking through them now is a way of understanding not just the stories they contain, but the relationship between a work of animation and the culture that embraced it. Goku's dragon fist in the 13th film, the golden dragon extending from his outstretched hand, the technique he would not use again in this form, was the last image of him at full extension in the theatrical tradition he had anchored since the summer of 1989. It was a way of closing something that had given a great deal, and the audience that saw it in theaters in the summer of 1995 knew they were seeing the end of something, even if they did not yet have the words for what that something had been. What the theatrical tradition gave the franchise was, among other things, a proof of concept. It demonstrated that Dragon Ball Z stories could be told in different registers and at different scales and with different temporal structures, without losing what made them Dragon Ball Z stories. It demonstrated that antagonists without manga precedent could connect with audiences if the essential elements of their construction were correct. It demonstrated that the characters the series had built, Goku's particular openness, Vegeta's particular pride, Piccolo's particular guardedness, Gohan's particular response to immediate emotional provocation, were robust enough to carry stories that the original authors had not planned, as long as those stories respected the truth of who those characters were. This proof of concept was not without its limits. The theatrical tradition also demonstrated the ways in which non-canonical stories could create complications for canonical continuity, the ways in which the freedom of the theatrical setting could produce choices that fit the films individually, but sat awkwardly against a larger story. These were real limitations, and the people who thought carefully about Dragon Ball Z's continuity noted them. But they did not diminish the film's achievements within their own scope, and they did not reduce the genuine pleasure that the best entries provided on their own terms. The Dragon Ball Z theatrical tradition was what it was: 13 films made with care and love and varying degrees of success over 5 years. For audiences who loved the characters and wanted more of them in the most direct and concentrated form available, it produced genuine classics, and it produced films that were lesser by comparison, but still worthwhile. And it closed with a technique that put a golden dragon in the sky above the final fight. And the credits rolled, and the tradition was complete. There is a particular quality to a story that knows how to end. Not every story does. Some stories continue past the point of their natural conclusion, finding new things to say but losing in the process the particular weight that comes from finality. The Dragon Ball Z theatrical tradition, as a body of work, ended before it had exhausted itself, ended while it still had the energy that had characterized its best moments, while the characters it centered were still at the height of the phase of their development that the films had been built to celebrate. The films would be revisited. Dragon Ball Super would restore Broly to the main story. The characters would continue in new contexts, new forms, new configurations. But the theatrical tradition that had run from 1980 to 1995 was its own thing, and its completion was not the same as an ending. It was a phase concluding, a particular conversation finishing, a seasonal tradition reaching the natural limit of its duration. The audiences who had attended those seasonal events had grown up alongside the films. The children who saw the first film in July of 1989 were 17 years old when the 13th film arrived in the summer of 1995. They had grown from children who came to see a boy retrieve his son into young adults who had watched season by season as the franchise around them expanded its scope and its ambition and the scale of the threats it was willing to imagine. The theatrical tradition had accompanied that growth, had been part of the seasonal rhythm of a childhood that the franchise had in various ways helped to shape. This is not a small thing. This is in fact one of the things that the best animated franchises accomplish, that they become part of the texture of a generation's experience, part of the cultural furniture of a particular time and place, part of the shared reference that people who grew up together can draw on decades later in conversations that are about something else entirely. Dragon Ball Z did this in Japan in the late 1980s and early 1990s, and the theatrical tradition was one of the ways it did it. One of the mechanisms through which the franchise entered the seasonal rhythm of childhood and became associated with specific times of year and specific experiences and specific feelings. Those feelings persist. They are not dependent on the films being perfect, or on the antagonists being the deepest or the most carefully constructed in the canon. They are dependent simply on the films having existed, and on having been seen, and on having provided in 45 minutes or 60 minutes twice a year for 5 years. Something that was worth the price of a ticket, and the choosing of a seat, and the particular attention of a young audience that had gathered to see the characters it loved at the height of their abilities. On the biggest screen available, the theatrical tradition provided all of this. It provided it 13 times over 5 years, with varying degrees of success and consistent amounts of care. And what it built over those 5 years was not a single monument, but a series of smaller specific gifts, each one a separate act of creation, each one addressing itself to a specific season and a specific audience and a specific moment in the life of a franchise that was itself specific to a time and a place and a cultural conversation. The Dragon Ball Z films are not all that Dragon Ball Z was, but they are part of it, genuinely and permanently, part of the larger thing, contributing to it and shaped by it and carrying within them, even now, the energy of the moment that produced them. That energy is still there when you watch them. It does not require a Japanese theater in the early 1990s to be felt. It requires only a willingness to receive what was offered, with some understanding of what the offering was, a story told carefully within its constraints about characters that mattered to the people who made the film and who were allowed, for the duration of one theatrical season's afternoon, to be as extraordinary as they were capable of being. It is worth returning to the first film one more time, from a different angle, because the first film did something that every subsequent entry in the theatrical tradition would either learn from or respond to in some way. It established what the theatrical experience was going to feel like at its most fundamental level. The feeling was this: you were going to be given something concentrated. You were going to receive, in a shorter and more intense form than the broadcast series could provide, the essential qualities of the franchise you loved. You were going to see these characters doing what they did, protecting, fighting, caring for each other, discovering what they were capable of when the stakes were at their highest. And you were going to see all of this on a screen large enough that the experience had a physical dimension to it, a weight that the body registered alongside the mind. This was not a complicated promise. It was a very simple one. And the theatrical tradition kept it 13 times over 5 years, with a consistency that made the tradition worth attending and worth returning to. Goku himself, as a character, is served differently by the theatrical tradition than by the broadcast series. The broadcast series had the space to explore his contradictions, his occasional obtuseness, his relationship with his family, and the complicated way he navigated being both a father and a warrior in a world that made enormous demands on him. The films, working faster and with less space, tended to present a Goku who was closer to a distillation, a Goku who was most fully himself in the moment of his greatest challenge, whose essential qualities were clarified rather than complicated by the compressed narrative around him. This was not a lesser Goku. It was a different aspect of the same character, the aspect that rose most clearly when there was no time for anything except the response to what was immediately in front of him. The theatrical tradition gave this aspect of Goku a series of stages, each one calibrated to what the story of each film required. And across those stages you could see something consistent, the particular quality of his attention to other people, the specific way he held his ground when everything around him was in motion, the way his defeats were never truly defeats because they were always measurements, always teaching him something about where he was and where he needed to go. Vegeta in the theatrical tradition was, as noted, handled with particular intelligence in the strongest entries. The 6th film and the 12th film were the clearest demonstrations of this, but he was present in other entries as well, background sometimes, active sometimes, always carrying the specific weight of a character whose pride and whose capability existed in attention that the films could draw on without needing to fully explain. The audience understood Vegeta because the broadcast series had built him carefully, and the theatrical films could inherit that understanding and use it, trusting that the audience would fill in what the films left to implication. Piccolo moved through the theatrical tradition with a particular quality of someone who has committed to a different relationship with the world than the one he was built for. He had been designed as an instrument of destruction, and he had chosen, gradually, to become something else: a guardian, a teacher, a figure who stood between those he cared about and the things that threatened them. The films honored this choice consistently, giving him moments that acknowledged both what he had been and what he had become, and allowing the tension between those two things to be present without requiring it to be resolved. There is one more quality of the Dragon Ball Z theatrical tradition that deserves acknowledgement before this account concludes, and it is perhaps the most difficult to describe directly: the quality of having been loved. The films were loved. They were loved by the audiences who saw them in theaters, and they were loved by the international audiences who discovered them later, and they were loved by the people who made them, the animators and the directors and the composers and the voice actors who worked on them, and who brought to each entry the specific kind of engagement that comes from caring about the material you are working with. This love is visible in the work. It is visible in the care taken with the character animation at moments that could have been treated as routine. It is visible in the deliberateness of the musical choices, in the way certain themes recurred across films and were varied and developed as the tradition progressed. It is visible in the texture of the antagonists, who were given more interiority than the requirements of a 45-minute film strictly demanded, because the people making the films wanted the antagonists to be worth the effort of the heroes who defeated them. It is visible in the choices made about which characters to include and which relationships to develop. The filmmakers loved the material enough to argue, through their choices, about which aspects of it were most worth dwelling on. Every film is in this sense a document of what the people making it found most interesting, most beautiful, most worth spending their working time on. And across 13 films over 5 years, the accumulation of those documents tells a story about the Dragon Ball Z franchise that is its own kind of history, a record not of what happened in the official story, but of what the people who worked with the official story cared about most. That history is not separate from the franchise, it is part of it. The Dragon Ball Z theatrical tradition is part of Dragon Ball Z in the way that any sustained engagement with a beloved thing becomes part of it. Through the attention, through the care, through the specific ways that the people who loved it chose to express that love in work that others could receive and share and love in turn. This is the condition in which the theatrical tradition exists now, decades after its production, as something that was loved into existence and that carries that love inside it still, available to anyone who approaches it with the willingness to receive what was offered and the patience to let the slow-moving, calm, cinematic, carefully made films unfold at the pace they were designed for. The pace is unhurried. The frames are full of detail. The music rises when it is supposed to rise and falls when it is supposed to fall. The characters move through their stories with the authority of figures who have been understood by the people showing them, and the stories reach their conclusions with the completeness of things that were built to be complete. They are, in the end, exactly what they were made to be. And that is more than enough. Thanks for spending this time in the Dragon Ball universe with me. If you'd like to keep drifting, another video is ready on the left of your screen. Maybe let it play as you close your eyes. Sleep might find you before the next story finishes. This was, in retrospect, one of the most consequential choices the theatrical tradition made. The broadcast series was gradually building Gohan toward a role that would culminate in the Cell Saga, but the films had access to him earlier, and they used that access in ways that gave the theatrical tradition its own specific relationship to his development. Each film that featured him added a layer to the understanding of who he was, what he responded to, what he protected, what he was willing to endure and what he was not. Gohan in the first film was a 4-year-old who did not know his own strength and expressed it once, involuntarily, in a moment of extremity. Gohan in the 8th film was a teenager facing a villain his father and his companions could not overcome, gathering himself in a particular way that the films had taught audiences to expect from him. The distance between those two versions of the same character was traversable only by watching the films in sequence, and the theatrical tradition provided that sequence, provided the accumulation of small moments that made the larger moments legible. This accumulation was the theatrical tradition's quieter achievement. The individual films could be appreciated independently, and they were. They were designed to be appreciated independently by audiences who might not have seen every previous entry. But for those who followed the entire tradition, from the summer of 1989 to the summer of 1995, there was a secondary story running beneath the stated stories of each individual film. The story of these characters aging, developing, becoming more completely themselves over the course of the decade, with the theatrical tradition offering a seasonal counterpoint to the weekly development of the broadcast series. The relationship between the theatrical films and the broadcast series is one of the more interesting structural features of the Dragon Ball Z franchise, and it deserves a more extended consideration than it typically receives. The broadcast series was, during the theatrical tradition's active period, being produced at a pace and a volume that made it the dominant version of the story. It was where the canonical events occurred. It was where the transformations were first shown, where the major antagonists were defeated, where the relationships between characters developed in the ways that would define them for the rest of the franchise's history. The theatrical films were supplementary, adjacent, as noted earlier, and their relationship to the broadcast series continuity was, from the beginning, complicated. The first film was ambiguous about its own placement in the timeline. The second film introduced technology and circumstances that did not quite align with the broadcast series' established facts. Each subsequent film navigated the question of continuity with varying degrees of care and success, some of them trying to establish clear temporal placement, and some of them simply working within the shared world without specifying exactly where within that world they existed. This ambiguity was not an oversight, it was, in the most practical sense, a necessity. The films were produced on a schedule that ran parallel to the broadcast series, not in coordination with it, and the practical impossibility of perfectly synchronizing two different production pipelines meant that some degree of inconsistency was inevitable. The creative teams working on the films had access to the broadcast series' general trajectory, and they worked to ensure that the films felt consistent with the characters and the world the series was building, but they could not guarantee that every detail would align. What they could guarantee was that the essential qualities of the characters would be honored, and this, in the end, was the more important guarantee. A fan who watched a Dragon Ball Z film and recognized Goku as Goku, who felt that the character on screen was continuous with the character they knew from the broadcast series, who responded in ways consistent with his established values and his established relationships, received something genuine regardless of whether the film's specific events fit neatly into the canonical timeline. The theatrical tradition trusted its audience to make this distinction implicitly, and the audience made it. The films were loved not because their continuity was perfect, but because they were good, because the characters were recognizable, because the stories were engaging, because the animation was beautiful, and because the experience of watching them in a theatrical setting was something that the broadcast series, for all its virtues, could not replicate. There is a technical dimension to the Dragon Ball Z theatrical tradition that deserves acknowledgement, because the craft involved in creating these films was, at its best, genuinely impressive. The animation process for a theatrical feature, even one produced on the timelines and budgets that characterize the Dragon Ball Z films, was substantially more labor-intensive than the production of a television episode. Every frame of a theatrical film was going to be projected at a scale that made imprecision visible in ways that television's smaller format and lower resolution concealed. The animators working on the theatrical entries were working with the knowledge that their work would be scrutinized by audiences in ways that episodic television production did not quite demand. This awareness raised the quality of the work. The key animation in the strongest theatrical entries, the drawings that defined the poses and the movements and the moments of dynamic action, was done by animators who were, in many cases, the most skilled people working in Japanese animation at the time. The Dragon Ball Z production drew from a pool of talent that included some of the most accomplished practitioners in the industry, and the theatrical films, with their higher budgets and their theatrical expectations, brought out the highest levels of that talent. The coloring of the theatrical films was also distinct from the broadcast series. The palette was richer, the gradients more carefully rendered, the backgrounds painted with a detail and a depth that went beyond what the weekly production schedule permitted. This difference in visual texture was one of the things that made the theatrical experience feel genuinely different from watching the series at home. The richness of the image, the density of the detail, the sense that every square centimeter of the frame had been attended to with care. The sound design benefited from theatrical presentation as well. The dramatic silence of an anticipatory moment, the full-bodied impact of a strike at theatrical volume, the orchestral swell of a climactic transformation. These elements were calibrated to a theatrical acoustic environment, and they landed with a weight in that environment that home viewing, even on a good system, could only approximate. The theatrical experience was designed to be felt as well as seen, and the best films in the tradition were made with that multi-sensory dimension in mind. The decade that produced the Dragon Ball Z theatrical tradition was, in Japan, a specific cultural moment in the history of animated entertainment. The late 1980s and early 1990s were a period in which anime was solidifying its position as a dominant form of popular culture, not just in Japan, but increasingly in the broader international conversation about animation and storytelling. Dragon Ball Z was one of the flagship properties of this moment, and its theatrical releases were part of the larger phenomenon that the series represented. The Dragon Ball franchise had established itself through the original series, which ran from 1986 to 1989, and which had already demonstrated the audience that existed for Toriyama's characters and world. Dragon Ball Z, which followed immediately and ran from 1989 to 1996, was working from that foundation and expanding it, introducing new characters, raising the stakes, extending the scope of the conflict from a single planet to a galaxy and eventually to the universe. The theatrical films accompanied this expansion, each one offering a version of the expanding world at a scale and a compression that the broadcast series, committed to its own more extended narrative, could not always provide. This was the theatrical tradition's position in the broader culture. It was the concentrated form of something that existed in diluted form elsewhere, and the concentration was both its appeal and its limitation. You went to see a Dragon Ball Z film knowing what you were going to receive, the characters you loved at their most capable, facing a threat calibrated to the scale of the theatrical experience. The films did not usually surprise you with what they were. They surprised you, at their best, with how well they were. The international spread of the Dragon Ball Z theatrical tradition followed the pattern of the franchise's broader international distribution, which was itself a complex and gradual process. The series arrived in different countries at different times, through different distribution arrangements and with different degrees of completeness. The theatrical films followed behind the series, arriving in markets where the broadcast series had already established an audience and were received with the enthusiasm of people who had been waiting for more. The English language market received the films primarily through Funimation's distribution, which began in the late 1990s and continued through the early 2000s. The dubbing process introduced the films to an audience that had not grown up with them as seasonal theatrical events, but that had developed an equally deep attachment to the characters through the broadcast series. This second generation of Dragon Ball Z film viewers related to the theatrical tradition differently than the first. They encountered the films as a catalog to explore rather than as a seasonal ritual to attend, but their attachment to the material was no less genuine for being differently structured. The international reception also introduced the films to critical frameworks that the original Japanese theatrical context had not anticipated. Western anime criticism, which was developing sophisticated tools during the late 1990s and early 2000s, looked at the Dragon Ball Z films through lenses shaped by different cultural assumptions and different storytelling traditions. Some of what those lenses revealed was genuinely useful. The willingness to compare the films to other animated features from different cultural contexts produced insights that the internal Japanese critical conversation had not always reached. Some of what they revealed was less useful. The tendency to evaluate the films against standards they were not designed to meet produced criticisms that were technically accurate but not quite germane. The most productive critical engagement with the theatrical tradition was always the engagement that met the films on their own terms, that understood what they were trying to accomplish, appreciated how well they accomplished it, and noted where they fell short of their own ambitions. This kind of engaged, specific criticism was available from the beginning to readers who knew the material, and it has become more widely available as the franchise has aged and as the tools for thinking about it have become more developed. Every film in the theatrical tradition had, in addition to its central antagonist and its central narrative, a quality of texture that was specific to it, a particular atmosphere, a particular way of inhabiting the world it built for its running time. The first film had the texture of something being established for the first time, the care of a production that understood it was building a tradition, and that every choice it made would define what the tradition was. The mountain setting, the kidnapping of a child, the parents' response, these were elements chosen to establish at the very beginning what the Dragon Ball Z theatrical experience would offer. The film had the confidence of something that knew its purpose. The sixth film had the texture of invention, the pleasure of a creative team that had found, in the mechanism of the Big Get star, something genuinely novel. And that was using it with the enthusiasm of people who were excited about the territory they were exploring. The metal cooler, the replicated confrontations, the distributed consciousness, these were ideas that the film inhabited with the energy of genuine discovery. The 12th film had the texture of occasion, the quality that comes from a film that knows it is doing something significant, that the fusion it is about to show has been anticipated, and that the responsibility of that anticipation requires a kind of care that goes beyond the requirements of any individual sequence. The film rose to that occasion with a gravity that matched what was being shown. The 13th film had the texture of completion, not conclusion in the sense of finality, since the franchise would continue, but completion in the sense of reaching the end of a defined thing, of arriving at the last page of a particular chapter. The Dragon Fist technique, the quiet farewell of Tapion, the closing of the theatrical tradition's decade. These were elements that carried the weight of something understood to be ending, and the film held that weight without being crushed by it. The Dragon Ball Z films taken together constitute a particular body of work, not identical with the franchise that produced them, and not separate from it, but related to it in the way that a collection of letters relates to the biography of the person who wrote them. They are supplementary and illuminating, and sometimes contradictory, and always genuine. They are the work of people who cared about the characters they were working with, and who found, in the specific constraints of theatrical animation, ways to show that care in concentrated form. They are also practically very entertaining, which is the quality that has kept them watchable across the decades since their production. Entertainment is not a small thing. It is not a lesser thing than the various other qualities that works of popular culture are evaluated for. The Dragon Ball Z theatrical films were made to entertain the audiences that received them, and they succeeded at this with a consistency that the tradition's best entries demonstrated absolutely. They were fun to watch. They were exciting. They were moving when they tried to be moving, and funny when they tried to be spectacular. This is the record that the theatrical tradition left. 13 films, made with care, enjoyed by millions, carrying the energy of their production across decades. Available still to anyone who wants to enter the world they built and spend 45 minutes or 60 minutes in the company of characters who gave their best on the screen that hosted them. The Golden Dragon extended from Goku's fist one more time in the summer of 1995, and the theatrical tradition completed itself, and the world it had helped to build continued in other forms and other contexts, carrying forward the things the films had established and the things the films had proven, and the particular quality of affection that 13 concentrated acts of storytelling had generated across 5 years of seasonal release. It was enough. It was, in its particular way, exactly enough. There is something worth understanding about the specific energy that Garlic Jr. brought to the first film, something that goes beyond the surface reading of a small villain with large ambitions. He was not trying to conquer Earth in the way that later antagonists would attempt to conquer or destroy it. He was trying to claim something that he believed had been taken from him. The position of guardian, the role that his father had been denied and that he had inherited the denial of, carrying it across his life the way a person carries an old wound that never quite closed. This distinction matters. Garlic Jr. was not nihilistic. He had a specific grievance and a specific goal, and the universe had given him, through the mechanism of the Dragon Balls, the tool to pursue that goal. The wish for immortality was not vanity, it was strategy. An immortal cannot be stopped. An immortal can wait for every opponent to tire, to be distracted, to make a single mistake. An immortal guardian of Earth would be, by definition, the permanent guardian of Earth. And that permanence was the only revenge available against a system that had denied his father and, by inheritance, had denied him. The film did not dwell on this. It moved at the pace a theatrical animated film needed to move, and the audience received the information they needed to understand the antagonist without being given a documentary's worth of context. But the information that was provided was sufficient to make Garlic Jr. something more than a placeholder. He was a character with a history, and the history justified his presence, and the justification made his defeat carry the particular weight of a wrong being addressed rather than simply an obstacle being removed. The second film's Dr. Wheelo represents a different kind of antagonist philosophy, one centered not on grievance but on aspiration. He wanted something he had lost, or more precisely something he had never had in the form he now wanted it, and the tragedy of his situation was that the thing he wanted was also the thing he was least equipped to understand. He was a brain, he was pure intelligence, preserved in a mechanical shell, and what he wanted was to be in a body, to be, again, an embodied person in the world. But his understanding of embodiment was entirely theoretical by the time the film began. He had been in the mechanical apparatus for long enough that his memory of having a body, of experiencing the world through flesh and sensation, and the particular vulnerability of organic existence had become abstract. He knew intellectually that having a body was different from not having one. He did not quite remember what that difference felt like, and this gap between knowing and remembering was the source of a particular kind of pathos that the film gestured toward without fully developing. His pursuit of the strongest body in the world was, in this light, poignant in a way he himself could not recognize. He assumed that the finest possible body would give him the finest possible experience of embodiment. He assumed that power was the variable that mattered, when the variable that mattered was simply presence, simply the experience of being a person in a place, with senses and limitations and the ordinary vulnerability that makes ordinary experience feel like anything at all. If he had succeeded, if he had taken the strongest body available and inhabited it, he would likely have found that the experience was not what he had imagined, that strength alone does not give a person back what they have lost, that the thing he missed was not power but simply being present in the world in the way that all living things are present, partially, imperfectly, with needs and limits and the knowledge of mortality that makes each moment specific and unrepeatable. The film did not have the space to explore this, but it is there in the margins, available to anyone who looks at Dr. Wheelo with sufficient patience. He was a scientist who had made extraordinary discoveries about the nature of life, and in the process he had separated himself from the condition that had motivated the inquiry in the first place. He had studied life and had ended up outside it. The irony was quiet and complete. The Tree of Might in the third film deserves more attention than it typically receives as a piece of the Dragon Ball Z universe's world building. It was not simply a device for a third film's antagonist. It was an idea about what power was and where it came from and what it cost. The tree extracted energy from living systems. It drew from every plant, every animal, every microorganism on the surface of a planet, drew slowly over time until nothing remained and the planet itself was drained. The fruit it produced concentrated all of that extracted energy into a single consumable form. One person ate the fruit and received the power that had belonged to an entire biosphere. The exchange was absolute and irreversible. This was not presented as evil. The tree did not have intentions. It was a mechanism, a very old mechanism operating according to principles that pre-existed any particular planet it happened to land on. Turles had found it, or had access to it through some process the film did not explain at length, and he was using it. The fact that using it would destroy the Earth was not, from his perspective, a moral consideration. It was a practical one, and it was one he had weighed and found acceptable. What the film was doing, in presenting this situation, was asking a question that the Dragon Ball Z franchise would return to in various forms across its history. What is the appropriate relationship between a strong individual and the weaker beings who share the world with them? Turles answered the question one way. Goku answered it another way. Neither of them articulated their answers in philosophical terms. They simply acted on them, and the collision of their actions was what the film was about. Turles' position was not incoherent. He had power. Power and the framework he operated within was the fundamental value, the quality that determined one's relationship to the world and to the beings in it. The weak existed to be used or ignored by the strong, and the particular weakness of the beings on Earth was, from his perspective, simply a fact to be noted and incorporated into his planning. He was not cruel about it. He offered Goku the fruit. Genuinely, he thought the offer was reasonable. He could not quite understand why it was refused. Goku's refusal was based on something that Turles' framework had no category for. Not strength, not ambition, not pride or honor in any form that Turles would have recognized. It was based on the particular kind of connection that Goku had developed with the beings around him, the specific bonds of care and obligation that had accumulated over years of living among people who were weaker than him and who had never been anything other than precious to him because of that weakness, not in spite of it. The film expressed this through the spirit bomb. The technique required those living beings to donate their energy willingly. It required their consent, their participation, their active choice to give what they had to someone who needed it. This was the exact inverse of what the tree had done. The tree extracted without permission. The spirit bomb received with permission. And the contrast was the film's central philosophical statement, made without a word of dialogue. Lord Slug in the fourth film introduced a dimension of Namekian lore that the broadcast series had not yet had space to fully develop, the distinction between the two branches of Namekian society, and what happened to the members of the darker branch when they followed their nature without the corrective influence that the planet's history had tried to provide. The Namekians in the broadcast series were primarily people the audience had come to know and care about, Piccolo and Nail and Guru, and the villagers who had welcomed Gohan and Krillin to their planet. They were wise or gentle or brave or some combination of these things. They were people. The Dragon Clan and the warrior type together formed a picture of a species that had developed over centuries a particular orientation toward the world, toward caretaking, and toward strength used in service of caretaking. Lord Slug was a reminder that this orientation had not always been universal among his kind. The Super Nameks, the term the film used for those who had access to power beyond the ordinary Namekian range, had existed before him, and some of them had used that power in ways that the rest of Namekian society had ultimately judged incompatible with continued coexistence. Slug had been among those exiled, sent away from the planet, cast out into space, allowed to continue existing but no longer permitted to do so among people who could be harmed by what he was. He had survived. He had lived in space for a very long time, sustaining himself through means the film did not specify, aging and then renewing and aging again in the cycle his particular biology permitted. And he had come, eventually, to Earth, not because Earth was special, not because Goku was there, but because Earth was habitable and because it was, at the moment of his arrival, in his path. This incidental quality of his arrival was part of what made Slug interesting as an antagonist. He was not a response to anything the heroes had done. He was not motivated by a specific grievance against them, because he had not known they existed until he arrived. He came to Earth the way a very old and very powerful thing comes to any place that happens to be in front of it, without particular regard for what was already there, without hostility, without anything that could be called an intention beyond the continuation of his own existence and the expansion of his own domain. The heroes were in his way. He would remove them. It was nothing more than that, and nothing less. The fifth film's Cooler has a quality that distinguishes him from every other antagonist in the theatrical tradition. And it is this: he was wrong about his own motivations, and the film knew it and let the wrongness sit without correcting it. He told himself and told the audience that he was there to restore his family's honor, that Goku's defeat of Frieza had reflected poorly on the lineage they shared, and that the appropriate response was to demonstrate that the lineage was capable of producing something more capable than the person who had been defeated. He framed his arrival on Earth as a matter of principle and of obligation, something he was required to do, not by desire but by the logic of who he was. This framing had the surface quality of truth. The culture Cooler came from did in fact place significant weight on the kind of honor and hierarchy he was invoking. His reasons were culturally coherent. They were the reasons a member of his particular class and background would be expected to give for an action of this kind. But underneath the cultural coherence was something simpler and less flattering. Cooler had let the pod go. He had made a choice decades before not to act, not to intercept the pod, not to ensure that his brother's work was completed, not to involve himself in a situation he considered beneath his attention. And that choice had led, through a chain he could not have predicted, but also could not quite escape, to a situation that now required his response. He was not there purely to restore the family's honor. He was there because he had failed to act when action would have been simple, and the consequences of that failure had become visible, and he needed, not for the family's sake, but for his own, to address them. The honor framing gave him a structure for what was essentially a private reckoning. It made the action legible to himself and to others, without requiring him to acknowledge what it actually was. Goku characteristically did not engage with any of this. He responded to Cooler the way he responded to every antagonist, with the question of what needed to be done, and the focus required to do it. The philosophical dimension of the situation was entirely invisible to him, and that invisibility was, in its own way, its own kind of response to Cooler's elaborate self-justification. The sixth film's Big Gita Star raises questions that the film did not have the time to fully explore, but that are worth sitting with in the quiet space that a sleep documentary can offer. What is the relationship between an entity and the copies it produces? When Cooler's consciousness was distributed across the metal mass of the Big Gita Star, and when that consciousness produced the army of identical Cooler bodies that fought Goku and Vegeta, were those bodies Cooler? Were they expressions of Cooler? Were they something else entirely? Something that carried his data and his directive, but that had lost in the process of reproduction whatever it was that made Cooler specifically Cooler, and not simply a very powerful fighting unit with his face? This was not a question the film was built to answer. It was a theatrical action film, and its running time was devoted to the experience of watching Goku and Vegeta fight their way through something that should have been impossible to defeat. But the question is there in the concept, and it sits alongside the more explicit questions about identity that Broly's biological copy raised in the 11th film. The theatrical tradition returned, in different forms and through different mechanisms, to the question of what made someone themselves, what the essential quality was that could not be reproduced, even when everything else could be. The Big Gita Star answer was practical rather than philosophical. Cooler's distributed consciousness retained enough coherence to be a genuine antagonist, but the copies were not quite Cooler in the way the original had been Cooler. Something was lost in the distribution. What was lost was the specificity of a single perspective, the particular weight of existing as one thing in one place. making choices that could not be undone. The copies made choices too, but the choices were reversible. Any copy that was destroyed was simply replaced, and the pattern continued. This was power, but it was power of a specific kind, the power of replication rather than the power of presence. Vegeta, interestingly, was the one who identified the weakness in the system and exploited it. This was characteristic. Vegeta's analytical approach to combat, his ability to assess a situation and find the structural vulnerability rather than simply applying maximum force to maximum resistance, was one of the qualities that made him valuable in situations where raw power alone was insufficient. The sixth film used this quality with intelligence, giving Vegeta a role that was specifically his and that could not have been filled by any of the other characters in the story. Android 13 in the seventh film embodies a particular kind of ideological purity that makes him one of the more philosophically interesting antagonists in the theatrical tradition. Even if the film around him does not always use that philosophical interest to its full potential, he was a machine built with a singular purpose, the destruction of Son Goku. Dr. Gero had designed him with this purpose, and it was the first and most fundamental thing about him, the directive at the center of his operating architecture, the thing that every other capacity he possessed existed to serve. He did not have ambitions beyond this directive. He did not have desires beyond it. He existed to fulfill it, and everything he did was in service of that fulfillment. This makes him, in a strange way, simpler and more coherent than many of the organic antagonists the films presented. The organic villains were complicated by the full complexity of having a self, by having histories and grievances and ambitions that were in tension with each other and that had to be reconciled and managed, and sometimes suppressed in order to maintain the single focus that a confrontation with Goku required. Android 13 had none of these complications. His purpose was clear. His focus was absolute. His only question was tactical. What was the most effective way to achieve the outcome his directive specified? The film presented his final form, after absorbing the core units of his counterparts, as the completion of this logic. He had become more fully what he was built to be, a concentrated unit of purpose, all the energy and all the design of three separate constructions combined into a single instrument. The concentration was an achievement from a purely functional perspective. From any other perspective, it was a demonstration of what happens when purpose exists without the corrective influence of the other qualities that usually accompany it: curiosity, doubt, the capacity to be surprised, the ability to encounter something that exceeds the framework of what was anticipated and to update accordingly. Goku exceeded the framework. He always did. The most carefully constructed systems for defeating him tended to fail not because they were poorly designed, but because they were designed for a specific version of Goku. And Goku had a consistent tendency to become a slightly different version of himself under pressure. The legendary Super Saiyan of the 8th film deserves an extended consideration of what made the concept work as powerfully as it did, because the concept was, when stated plainly, not a simple one. The legendary Super Saiyan was not simply a stronger version of the Super Saiyan transformation. It was a different relationship to power altogether. The standard Super Saiyan transformation, golden hair, intensified ki, the charge of adrenaline and emotion that activated it, was something Goku and Vegeta and the others had to reach for, had to maintain, had to sustain through effort and will and the ongoing management of the enormous energy it required. They could transform and they could fight in that transformed state, but the transformation was something they were doing. It required them to be present to it. Broly was not doing his legendary Super Saiyan form in this sense. It was not something he reached for or maintained. It was simply what happened when his body was allowed to express itself without constraint. The transformation was not the maximum he could achieve. It was the baseline that everything else was being suppressed to conceal. This was the implication of the film's backstory, that even as an infant, the power level that had alarmed King Vegeta enough to order his death was already the expression of something being held back, something that had not yet found the container adequate to hold it. What the legendary Super Saiyan form expressed then was not the highest Broly could reach, it was the lowest he could be reduced to while still being recognized as himself. Everything above that lowest point was additional, and the film did not suggest there was a ceiling on what above might encompass. This was terrifying in a specific way. The standard narrative of Dragon Ball Z was, here is the current limit, and here is someone who exceeds it, and now the heroes must find a way to exceed that new limit in turn. The narrative had a structure, and the structure was navigable because it had a logic. Broly disrupted the logic. He was not someone who had exceeded a current limit. He was someone for whom the concept of a limit, as it applied to everyone else, did not clearly apply. The ceiling kept moving because the ceiling was being defined by a reference point that was itself undefined. The film solved this narratively through the collective technique, the gathering of energy from multiple sources, the concentration of it in Goku, the delivery of it as a single concentrated strike. The logic here was not about exceeding Broly's power level, but about finding a form of energy that could penetrate despite the disparity. Purity, perhaps. Will. The combination of multiple consciousnesses unified for a single purpose in a way that a single consciousness, however powerful, could not replicate. The spirit bomb logic applied in a more intimate key. Bojack's prison and his release deserve a moment of attention that the film moved past quickly in favor of the action it was primarily interested in. He had been sealed by the four Kaioshin, the supreme Kais, which meant that the beings who had imprisoned him were the highest divine authorities in the universe below the angels and the Omni King. This was not a casual act. The Kaioshin did not typically involve themselves directly in the affairs of individual villains. Their intervention implied a scale of threat that went beyond what the ordinary mechanisms of cosmic order could address. The fact that this intervention had been necessary, that Bojack had posed a threat requiring the direct action of divine beings, gave him a retroactive significance that the film's own presentation sometimes undersold. He was presented as a powerful villain, certainly, and his combat capabilities were demonstrated clearly and convincingly. But the full weight of what his imprisonment had implied, that he had once threatened something on a cosmic scale, that the four Kaioshin had found him worth the expenditure of their direct attention, was available to viewers who thought about it, and was not always fully foregrounded in the film itself. His companions were another matter. Beidou, Bujin, Kogu, and Zangya each contributed to the film's combat sequences in ways that served the story's structural needs. But it was Zangya who received the most attention from the animation staff and from the subsequent fan base. She was, in the original design work and in her animated appearances, drawn with a specific visual character that distinguished her from the other members of the group, a character that suggested there was more to her than the film had space to develop. The subsequent fan attention she received was a product of that suggestion, the sense that a more complete version of her story existed somewhere behind the scenes, accessible in principle if not in fact. This is one of the theatrical tradition's recurring qualities. The background characters and secondary antagonists were drawn with enough individual texture that they invited completion. They suggested depths that the film's running time precluded exploring, and those depths were filled in, over the years that followed, by the imaginations of the audience. The second Broly film's emotional center, the connection between the appearance of Goten and the reactivation of Broly's obsession, is worth exploring more fully than the film itself had room to develop. Goten was approximately 7 years old at the time of the 10th film. He had been born after Goku's death during the Cell Games, and he had grown up without his father in the present tense. Knowing him through stories, through the legacy he had left, through the way that Goku's influence on the world had shaped the people who raised and surrounded his younger son, he looked like Goku in a way that was more than superficial. The face, the hair, the posture, the particular way he inhabited space with the ease of someone who has never been taught to shrink. Broly, waking after 7 years in a frozen state on a remote planet, opened his eyes and saw that face. Saw, at a fundamental pre-reflective level, the person who had been the central object of his fury for his entire conscious life. Saw Kakaroto, The fact that what he actually saw was Kakaroto's son, 7 years old, innocent of everything that had happened between their fathers, not yet aware that there was anything unusual about this particular planetary encounter. This fact was not available to Broly at the moment of recognition. Recognition is faster than analysis. It arrived before the corrections could. And by the time any correction might have been possible, the correction was irrelevant. The connection had already established itself. The Fury had already found its new object. Goten existed to Broly as an extension of the thing that had persisted in him through 7 years of frozen unconsciousness, and the extension was sufficient. This was not a rational process. It was not supposed to be. The film was not trying to present Broly's fixation as a reasonable response to his situation. It was trying to present it as an example of what happens when something powerful enough and old enough runs on the tracks it was laid down in, regardless of whether those tracks still lead anywhere meaningful. Broly's hatred had become self-sustaining. It did not require a new injury to remain active. It required only a trigger, and the trigger did not need to be the person who had originally activated it. It only needed to resemble that person closely enough that the recognition could operate. Gohan's intervention, the older brother protecting the younger from something they both had no framework for, was one of the 10th film's more human passages. He did not fully understand what Broly was, or where he had come from, or why this encounter was happening. He understood that his little brother was in danger, and that the danger was greater than anyone else present could manage. He moved toward it. This was the essential Gohan, expressed in the simplest possible terms. The concept underlying Bio-Broly, the biological reconstruction of a defeated antagonist through genetic material, was, in the context of 1994 and the Dragon Ball Z franchise, a relatively novel idea for the theatrical tradition to engage with. It was not entirely original to the franchise. The broadcast series had already explored similar territory through the character of Cell, whose design incorporated the genetic material of multiple Saiyan and other warriors to produce something intended to be greater than any of its components. But Cell was a planned creation, built toward a specific capability, the product of an elaborate design process that had taken years to execute. The biological Broly was something messier than that. A rushed recreation using whatever genetic material could be sourced, produced by a scientist working under commercial rather than scientific pressure, resulting in something that shared its template's power without sharing its template's coherence. The distinction between coherence and power was the biological Broly's defining quality. The original Broly was coherent in the specific sense of being organized, of having a single perspective, however narrow and however fixed, that gave direction to the power he possessed. He was not unfocused. He was intensely focused, and the focus was the source of much of what made him dangerous. The biological copy had the power without the focus. It had the energy without the direction. It dissolved into something formless and expansive and indiscriminate, which was in some ways more frightening than the original, because formlessness at that scale of power is not controllable in the way that even a monomaniac obsession is controllable, in the specific sense that it has a known direction. The formless spreading of the biological Broly could go anywhere, could affect anything, had no particular target that could be isolated and addressed. The film's resolution through flooding, through the practical mechanism of a physical substance that neutralized the biological material, was in keeping with this formlessness. You cannot defeat something formless with a technique designed for a specific target. You address it the way you address a spill. You contain it, and you neutralize what you cannot remove. Fusion Reborn's approach to the afterlife deserves extended attention because it demonstrated something about the Dragon Ball Z universe's cosmology that the broadcast series had been building slowly and that the 12th film was able to use in concentrated form. The afterlife in Dragon Ball Z was not a simple binary of heaven and hell. It was an administrative structure, a large, complex, staffed organization responsible for processing the souls of the dead. evaluating them, assigning them to appropriate destinations, and managing the traffic between states of existence that a universe as populous as the one the series had established would necessarily generate. It had Oni, the workers who processed the energy of incoming souls. It had the check-in station. It had the vast plains of the other world where the dead could train and grow and exist in a form that was not quite the same as living existence, but that was not the absence of existence either. The failure that triggered the 12th film was a failure of administration. A young Oni had been neglecting his work. The evil energy he was supposed to process had been allowed to accumulate without being addressed. This was not a dramatic failure. It was a bureaucratic one. The kind of failure that happens when someone finds their work unrewarding and responds by allowing the standards of that work to slip until the accumulated slack becomes a crisis. The scale of the resulting crisis, the rupture, the dead returning to the living world, the formation of Yanemba from the accumulated evil, was vastly disproportionate to the scale of the original failure. This was the film's implicit commentary on the nature of neglect, that the consequences of failing to do small things are not always small consequences. The Oni's work was unglamorous. It was repetitive and it was invisible. The kind of work that is only noticed when it is not done, and that attracts no appreciation when it is done perfectly. He had decided that this unappreciated work was not worth doing, and the universe had responded to this decision with an event that required a fused god-level warrior to address. The Janemba who emerged from this accumulation was, in his initial form, almost comically benign in his presentation. Round, yellow, soft-voiced, playing with the dimensional fabric of reality the way a child plays with clay, making shapes, tearing holes, reconfiguring space without apparent understanding that the space he was reconfiguring had contents that were being disrupted. He was not malicious. He was curious and playful and completely indifferent to the consequences of his play. His second form, the red, precise, sword-carrying Janemba who emerged after Goku disrupted the first form, was the concentration of that indifference into something more coherent and more directed. He still had no particular goal, but he had in this second form a more focused expression of his essential nature, the pure, undirected energy of evil, given a temporary shape that was capable of fighting rather than simply existing. Gogeta's purification technique, the Stardust Breaker, was designed specifically for this nature. It did not destroy Yanemba. It cleaned him. It separated the evil energy from the souls it had incorporated and allowed those souls to return to their proper state. The villain's defeat was the completion of the work the neglectful Oni had failed to do, the processing of accumulated evil back into the system that had generated it, the restoration of the administrative balance that the neglect had disrupted. This made the 12th film, beneath its spectacle, a film about maintenance, about the unglamorous, invisible, essential work of keeping systems functioning, about what happens when that work is abandoned and about what it takes to restore things when the abandonment reaches crisis scale. It was a strange and specific theme for a Dragon Ball Z theatrical film, and the film, were it likely, you could watch the entire thing without ever consciously registering it, but it was there, organizing the story in ways that gave the events an internal coherence that went beyond the surface level of a very powerful villain being defeated by a very powerful hero. The Dragon Fist technique that ended the 13th film deserves one more consideration, a consideration of what it meant within the visual language the franchise had established over its years of existence. The franchise's most iconic technique was the Kamehameha. It had existed since the original Dragon Ball series, when Roshi demonstrated it for the first time on the beach of his island. It had been used by Goku in hundreds of iterations over thousands of episodes and 13 theatrical films. It was associated with the franchise in the way that a signature is associated with a person. You saw it and you knew immediately what and who you were looking at. The Dragon Fist was something different. It was not a beam. It was not a concentration of energy projected outward from a distance. It was a technique that required direct contact, required Goku to be at the point of impact, his body the instrument of delivery. The golden dragon that extended from his fist was not a weapon separate from him. It was an expression of him, his energy taking a specific and deliberate shape, the shape of a dragon, the shape of Shenron, the series' oldest visual symbol. The choice of the dragon image was not incidental. Shenron was the wish granter, the being summoned by gathering the Dragon Balls, the entity that appeared when all seven were assembled and that asked what was desired. He was associated throughout the franchise's history with transformation and change and the possibility of things becoming other than they were. The decision to use his image as the final form of Goku's most powerful technique in the theatrical tradition was a way of saying something about what Goku was, not a wish granter exactly, but a force of change, a presence that arrived in situations and left them different from how they had been, a person in whose wake things were other than they were before. The dragon extending from Goku's fist in the summer of 1995 was the franchise's most compressed statement of this idea. It was a single image carrying everything that 10 years of storytelling had been building toward: the boy who had carried a 4-star ball in the mountains, the warrior who had survived Namek and the androids and Cell, the father and the friend and the fighter who kept becoming more completely himself with each new challenge. The image held all of this without saying any of it, in the way that the best images in animated storytelling hold what the words around them cannot quite contain. There is one more dimension of the Dragon Ball Z theatrical tradition that deserves acknowledgement: the dimension of time and what it means that these films were made when they were made. They were made in the early 90s, in an industry and a culture that were in the middle of their own transformations. Japanese animation was changing during this period, and Dragon Ball Z was part of those changes, not leading them exactly, but participating in them, demonstrating what the medium could do at a particular level of investment and craft. The theatrical films were part of this demonstration. They showed what animated storytelling could achieve when given the resources of a theatrical production and the audience of a franchise with deep cultural roots. The specific quality of animation in the early 1990s was different from what came before and from what came after. The transition from entirely hand-drawn production to the digital compositing and coloring that began to appear in the mid-90s had not yet occurred, and the theatrical films of the Dragon Ball Z tradition were products of a purely analog process, every line drawn by hand, every color applied by hand, every element of every frame the result of a human being making a choice about a specific piece of paper. This process had a texture that digital production did not replicate, and that texture is part of what gives the films their specific visual character, the particular warmth of the colors, the quality of the lines, the way the backgrounds related to the character animation in ways that were possible because both were produced through the same hand-drawn process. This is not nostalgia for nostalgia's sake. It is an observation about what the films preserved, simply by being made when and how they were made, a record of a specific moment in the history of a craft, produced at that craft's highest level of execution within its particular moment. Future animated productions would do many things better than the Dragon Ball Z theatrical films. They would have cleaner lines and more consistent coloring and more sophisticated compositional tools and the ability to create visual effects that would have been impossible to achieve by hand. But they would not have the specific texture of these films because that texture was the product of specific circumstances that have not recurred and will not recur. It exists in these films and nowhere else. The last thing worth saying about the Dragon Ball Z theatrical tradition is something simple and true. The films mattered to the people who saw them. This is not a complicated point, and it does not require elaboration. The films were received with enthusiasm and with genuine affection by audiences who had chosen to spend their time with them. And that enthusiasm and that affection were warranted. They were the appropriate response to work that was genuinely good, to stories that were genuinely engaging, to characters that were genuinely worth caring about. The specific nature of what the films gave their audiences varied from film to film and from viewer to viewer. Some people found in the Broly films something that no other entry in the franchise provided, a kind of physical intensity, a scale of power made visual that answered a specific appetite for spectacle at its most concentrated. Others found in Fusion Reborn's Gogeta a long-anticipated union of two figures whose individual appeal was compounded by the particular energy of their combination. Others found in Wrath of the Dragons Tapion a character who expressed, through his particular situation and his particular sadness, something that the main cast of the franchise, for all its virtues, did not quite have room to express. These were different gifts from the same tradition given to different people in the same seats, received with a particular quality of attention that comes from choosing to be somewhere and choosing to give your time and your presence to what is being offered. The theatrical experience asked for that choice, and it asked for it seasonally, twice a year, for 5 years. The audiences who made that choice received in return 13 stories told at the pace and the scale that the stories deserved. No more, no less, exactly what the tradition was built to provide. In the quiet of wherever you find yourself tonight, this is the shape of what the Dragon Ball Z films were. A tradition built from choice, sustained by love, and completed with the grace of something that knew when it had said what it needed to say and was willing to let the silence that followed be its own kind of statement. The films are there when you want to return to them. They will be exactly what they were, patient, complete, full of the specific energy that the people who made them poured into them across 5 years of seasonal creation. They will not have changed. They never quite do. The voice performances that inhabited the Dragon Ball Z theatrical tradition deserve acknowledgement, because they were one of the primary ways the characters were made real for the audiences who received them, not just in the theatrical setting, but in every subsequent context in which the films were experienced. In the original Japanese, the core cast had been established across the broadcast series and carried into each theatrical production with a consistency that gave the audience a continuous and recognizable relationship with the characters. Masako Nozawa, who voiced Goku from the very first broadcast episode of the original Dragon Ball series in 1986, brought to each theatrical entry the same essential quality she had always brought, a performance that found in a character who was outwardly very simple a depth of specific detail that rewarded close attention. Goku's voice in her hands was not just a voice. It was a complete characterization, the quality of his attention, the specific timbre of his cheerfulness, the way his tone shifted in combat, the particular sound of him when he was working hard towards something he valued. All of this was consistent across hundreds of episodes and 13 theatrical films, and the consistency was itself an achievement of a kind that does not always receive adequate acknowledgement. Ryo Horikawa, who voiced Vegeta, brought to the theatrical entries the same controlled volatility that the character required, the ability to be contained and precise in his delivery while conveying, through the quality of that containment, the pressure of everything being held back. Vegeta's pride was audible in every line, not as arrogance exactly, but as the particular quality of someone who has defined himself entirely through the standards he holds himself to, and who is perpetually measuring the distance between those standards and his current position. The theatrical films required these performances to be present in slightly different circumstances than the broadcast series, to inhabit, in each film's compressed running time, the full range of the character rather than the specific note that a particular episode might focus on. The best theatrical entries were those in which this compression did not diminish the performance, but concentrated it, in which the smaller space available produced something denser and more immediately legible than a more extended presentation might have allowed. The production schedule of the Dragon Ball Z theatrical tradition had a particular rhythm that shaped the films in ways both visible and invisible. The spring films, the ones released at the Toei Anime Fair in March, were produced during the autumn and winter months that preceded them, during a period when the broadcast series was continuing and the theatrical production ran alongside it. The summer films, released in July, were produced in the spring months, again alongside the ongoing broadcast. This meant that the people working on the theatrical films were, in many cases, the same people working on the broadcast series. The two productions shared resources, not always smoothly, not without the tensions that come from competing demands on finite time and finite talent, and the theatrical films sometimes bore the marks of those tensions. In animation that was occasionally less consistent than the highest points of the film's strongest sequences, in moments where the resources available had been stretched by the simultaneous demands of the television production, but the tensions also had a productive dimension. The necessity of prioritizing meant that the theatrical film's strongest sequences were identified early in the production process and protected, given the best available animators, the most time, the closest attention. This meant that the climaxes of the theatrical films were almost always the best animated portions, which was the right priority for stories built toward climactic confrontations. The hierarchy of quality within each film was generally the hierarchy that served the story. The spring and summer schedule also meant that the theatrical films were calibrated, sometimes very precisely, to the emotional temperature of the broadcast series at the moment of their release. A film released in July of a given year would arrive in theaters while the broadcast series was in the middle of a specific arc, and the audience bringing their knowledge of that arc to the theatrical experience would be in a specific emotional relationship to the characters that the film could activate and build on. The films were not always consistent with the broadcast series' continuity, but they were consistently aware of the broadcast series' emotional state, and the best entries were designed to resonate with that state rather than contradict it. The relationship between Goku and Gohan across the theatrical tradition is one of the quieter through lines available to a viewer who watches all 13 films in sequence. It is not a relationship the films explicitly develop. They do not have conversations about it, do not pause to acknowledge it, do not ask the viewer to pay particular attention to it. But it is there, present in the background of each film where both characters appear, expressed through the specific ways the films chose to use them. In the first film, Goku retrieved his son. The retrieval was uncomplicated. Goku went to where Gohan was and brought him back. And the difficulty between the arrival and the return was the film's story. Gohan was passive in this first entry, a small figure around whom things happened, whose burst of power at the film's climax was an involuntary expression rather than a choice. He was the reason for the story rather than its agent. By the ninth film, the positions had almost entirely reversed. Goku was dead. He could not come to retrieve his son. The film required Gohan to be his own retrieval agent, to find within himself the resources that the situation demanded, without the safety of knowing his father was available if things exceeded his capacity. He had been growing toward this independence across the broadcast series, and the ninth film was the theatrical tradition's clearest statement of what that independence looked like in practice. Not the absence of his father's influence, which was present in everything Gohan was, but the presence of his own specific self making its own specific choices under specific circumstances that belonged entirely to him. The film handled the moment of Goku's brief appearance, the one moment permitted to him from the afterlife, with an economy that trusted the relationship to carry its own weight. There was not extensive dialogue. There was not a long exchange of feeling. There was simply the presence of the father at the moment when the son needed to know that the presence was available, and then the son continuing with what needed to be done. It was, as the best Dragon Ball Z moments tended to be, a story told in the gap between words. The tradition of the Toei Anime Fair deserves a brief note as the institutional context within which the Dragon Ball Z theatrical films existed. It was a film event, a seasonal gathering of new Toei animation releases, traditionally held in the spring, at which multiple films were shown as part of a single event. It had existed since the 1960s, and by the time Dragon Ball Z became its flagship property in the late 1980s, it had a well-established history and a well-established audience relationship with the Japanese children and families who attended it. The Dragon Ball Z films occupied different positions within the Toei Anime Fair programming over the years, sometimes as the primary attraction and sometimes sharing billing with other properties from Toei's roster. other animated series that were popular with the same audience demographic, whose theatrical entries ran alongside the Dragon Ball Z films in the same event package? The audience that attended the spring and summer toy events during the late 1980s and early 1990s would encounter the Dragon Ball Z films as part of this broader context. And the experience of the films was shaped by that context in ways that are difficult to fully reconstruct from the perspective of later decades. The institutional context of the toy anime fair gave the theatrical tradition its seasonal rhythm, and that rhythm was one of its most significant structural features. The thing that made the tradition feel like a tradition, that gave it the quality of an annual or semi-annual event rather than simply a series of individual films. The audience came back twice a year, expecting something new but familiar, something that continued the relationship they had developed with these characters while offering enough novelty to justify the return. The tradition understood this expectation and worked to meet it, and the consistency with which it met it over 5 years was part of what made the tradition culturally durable. What remains after all the films have been considered and the tradition has been traced from its beginning to its completion is the simplest possible statement about what the Dragon Ball Z theatrical tradition was. It was care, made visible. Care for the characters, who were handled with the respect owed to figures that a large number of people had invested themselves in. Care for the audience, who were offered something worth the price of a ticket and the choosing of a seat and the specific quality of attention that a theatrical setting invites. Care for the craft, which was practiced at a level that the circumstances of production sometimes made difficult to sustain, but that the people involved sustained nonetheless, because they understood that the work deserved the full extent of their ability. This care is the thing that does not expire. The specific details of each film's plot can be summarized, its villain's design can be described, its animation can be analyzed, but none of those descriptions quite captures what it was like to be in the presence of something made with this kind of sustained attention. The care created something that was more than the sum of its components, and that something is what has persisted in the people who experienced the films and in the culture that received them. The films are part of what Dragon Ball Z is. They are part of what the franchise meant to the people who grew up with it. They are part of the ongoing story of a series that began with a small boy in the mountains and expanded outward until it contained the entire universe. Within that expansion, the theatrical tradition occupied its specific place. 13 concentrated stories, made with love, offered seasonally, received with gratitude, and preserved now in the lasting form of the impression they made on everyone who was there. Rest well. The films will be there when you return to them, patient, complete, entirely themselves. Thanks for spending this time in the Dragon Ball universe with me. If you'd like to keep drifting, another video is ready on the left of your screen. Maybe let it play as you close your eyes. Sleep might find you before the next story finishes.